Lady Charlotte Pemberton had stopped crying about it exactly 11 days after her mother declared her tragically unmarriageable following the disastrous Marlborough House ball incident. The crying had been replaced by something far more dangerous: acceptance. She'd made herself a promise that night, staring at her reflection while her lady's maid removed the elaborate curls that had taken 3 hours to create. She would never, under any circumstances, diminish herself to secure a husband. Not her mind, not her opinions, and certainly not her rather unfortunate habit of speaking exactly what she thought at precisely the wrong moments. The incident itself had been embarrassingly simple. She'd corrected Lord Ashworth's misquotation of Adam Smith in front of half the ballroom, then compounded the offense by refusing to apologize when he'd called her unbecomingly educated. Her mother had been mortified. The marriage proposals, already sparse, had stopped entirely. Lord Ashworth had ensured that every drawing room in Edinburgh knew that Lady Charlotte Pemberton was far too clever for her own good. This was a revolutionary stance in 1843 Edinburgh, where a lady's value was measured by her ability to smile sweetly while saying nothing of substance. Scottish society preferred their women decorative and silent, like expensive china displayed on a shelf, beautiful to look at, but God forbid they actually speak. The unfortunate consequence of Charlotte's personal manifesto was that she'd spent the last 2 years watching every eligible gentleman in Edinburgh waltz with vapid young ladies who giggled on cue and had never expressed an opinion stronger than their preference for tartan patterns. More unbearable still was watching him, Alexander Sinclair, the Duke of Strathearn. Even thinking his name made Charlotte's treacherous heart perform acrobatics that would astound the performers at the Royal Lyceum Theatre. She'd fallen catastrophically, hopelessly, ridiculously in love with him during her debut season at a Highland gathering, where he'd actually conversed with her for nearly 15 minutes about a history book they'd both read. 15 glorious minutes during which he'd looked at her, truly looked at her, and discussed the Jacobite risings with genuine intellectual passion, not the condescending patience most men adopted when forced to humor educated women. Then Lady Margaret Fraser had appeared, dripping in family emeralds worth more than a small estate, and Alexander had excused himself with flawless ducal politeness. Charlotte had watched him dance with Lady Margaret, then with the exquisite Miss Eleanor Campbell, then with that season's diamond, Lady Isabel MacLeod. She'd understood the message with brutal clarity. Dukes didn't notice earls' daughters who read too much Scottish history and had passionate opinions about the Highland clearances. That had been 2 years ago. 2 years of watching Alexander from across ballrooms, always at a respectful distance. 2 years of seeing him surrounded by Scotland's most beautiful noble women. 2 years of carefully maintaining her dignity, whilst her foolish heart insisted on wanting what it couldn't have. She'd encountered him perhaps 30 times since that first conversation, always in formal settings, always with crowds between them, always with some stunning aristocrat requesting his attention or his dance. Charlotte had seen him just last month at the Assembly Rooms on George Street. He'd been dancing with 3 different ladies in succession, each more accomplished than the last. She'd stood near the refreshment table, pretending to be fascinated by the punch bowl whilst her chest ached with the futility of it all. Lady Isabel had monopolized him for 2 waltzes. 2. The scandal of it had kept the gossips occupied for weeks, everyone speculating that an announcement was imminent. And now, this crisp October morning, her father had announced yet another tedious visitor to their townhouse on Charlotte Square. "A very important guest, my dear," the Earl of Pemberton had said over breakfast, his tone suggesting this was somehow different from the parade of important guests who'd been traipsing through their drawing room for years. "A matter concerning the Highland land reforms. Parliamentary business. Do dress appropriately." Charlotte had looked at her father, really looked at him, and made a decision that was either brilliantly defiant or catastrophically stupid. Possibly both. She was done. Done with appropriate dresses that squeezed her ribcage until she could barely breathe. Done with having her hair tortured into elaborate styles that gave her migraines. Done with smiling politely at her father's political associates whilst they droned on about parliamentary matters they assumed she couldn't possibly comprehend. If she had to endure another afternoon of aristocratic tedium, she would at least be comfortable. Which is how, 90 minutes later, Charlotte found herself standing in her bedchamber, staring at her reflection with a mixture of grim satisfaction and mild horror. The dress she'd chosen was a disaster. The dress had been a mistake from the beginning, ordered during a brief mourning period for a distant aunt 2 years ago, when gray had been appropriate. But the dressmaker had misunderstood the measurements, creating something that hung formlessly, the cheap wool scratching like punishment against her skin. The buttons down the back were uneven, 3 of them visibly mismatched. Even the hem was crooked, showing her scuffed boots at uneven intervals. The color made her olive complexion look vaguely ill, as if she were recovering from some wasting disease. It was, objectively, the ugliest garment she'd ever owned. Perfect. Her hair she'd attempted to pin herself after dismissing her lady's maid with the excuse of a headache. The result was, well, it was half secured and half falling, creating an effect that could generously be described as recently caught in a windstorm, or less generously as hasn't owned a mirror in weeks. No jewelry, no shawl, no gloves, nothing that suggested she'd invested any effort whatsoever into her appearance. Moira, her lady's maid, had actually gasped when she'd seen the final result. "Miss Charlotte, ye cannot. Your mother will." "My mother will survive," Charlotte had said firmly, sweeping past her toward the door. The wool scratched against her skin with each movement, a constant reminder of her rebellion. "I'm properly covered, aren't I? Nothing scandalous. Just spectacularly unremarkable." That had been the goal. Unremarkable. Forgettable. So thoroughly unimpressive that whatever pompous politician or businessman was visiting would barely register her presence. She'd appear for precisely the minimum time required by etiquette, say as little as possible, and escape to the library at the first opportunity. It was a solid plan. A reasonable plan. Charlotte descended the main staircase with her head high, prepared for her mother's inevitable disapproval. The gray wool dress swished awkwardly around her ankles with each step, the uneven hem catching occasionally. One of her hastily pinned curls had already come loose and hung limply against her neck. She looked, she knew, like exactly what she'd intended. A young woman who couldn't be bothered with the exhausting performance of femininity that society demanded. Her mother would be horrified. Good. Perhaps after this afternoon's disaster, they'd finally stop parading her in front of eligible gentlemen who had no interest in intelligent conversation and every interest in docile, decorative wives. Charlotte reached the bottom of the stairs and smoothed her hands over the dreadful gray dress one final time. Through the partially open door of her father's study, she could hear the low murmur of male voices. Her father's familiar baritone, and another voice, deeper, cultured, with that particular cadence that spoke of education and authority, saying something about Highland estates and tenant rights. She took a breath, squared her shoulders, and prepared to be thoroughly, blessedly invisible for the next hour. Then she pushed open the door and walked into her father's study, fully committed to her rebellion, the scratchy wool against her skin a reminder that comfort mattered more than appearance. The plan lasted approximately 5 seconds. Charlotte's plan lasted approximately 5 seconds after she entered her father's study. Because there, standing beside her father's mahogany desk near the windows overlooking the gardens, dressed in an immaculately tailored dark green coat that fit his broad shoulders in a way that should probably be illegal, was Alexander Sinclair, Duke of Strathearn, the man she'd loved in desperate secret for 2 years, the man who absolutely, positively should not be seeing her looking like an unemployed governess who'd given up on life. Charlotte stopped so abruptly, she nearly tripped over her own feet. Her hand shot out to grip the doorframe for support. Every muscle in her body tensed with the overwhelming urge to flee. The scent of beeswax from the polished furniture mixed with her rising panic. She took one step backward, then another, the crooked hem of her dress catching on her boot. Her mother's hand clamped around her elbow like an iron manacle wrapped in velvet. "Charlotte," the Countess of Pemberton said, her voice honey-sweet and utterly terrifying. "Do come greet our guest." Charlotte's father, the Earl of Pemberton, looked up from whatever document he and the Duke had been examining. His expression flickered through several emotions in rapid succession: surprise, confusion, and what might have been suppressed amusement. "Ah, Charlotte," her father said, his voice carefully neutral. "May I present His Grace, the Duke of Strathearn." "Your Grace, my daughter, Lady Charlotte Pemberton." This was hell. This was actual, literal hell. Alexander turned toward her, and Charlotte watched his expression with the fatalistic calm of someone watching their own execution. She waited for the polite indifference, the barely concealed disappointment, perhaps even a flicker of pity for the Earl's unfortunate daughter who apparently dressed herself in the dark. What she saw instead made her breath catch in her throat. Alexander Sinclair was staring at her with undisguised fascination. His dark blue eyes, she'd forgotten how intensely blue they were, like the North Sea on a stormy day, traveled over her disheveled appearance, not with disgust or disappointment, but with something that looked distinctly like delight. One corner of his mouth curved upward in a smile that transformed his usually serious expression into something warm and genuine and utterly devastating. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his deep voice carrying a note of warmth that sent shivers down her spine. He stepped forward and bowed, a proper bow, not the perfunctory nod most men gave to unmarried ladies they considered beneath their notice. What an unexpected pleasure. Unexpected? That was certainly one word for it. Charlotte's mind raced through her limited options. She could faint. No, too dramatic. Claim sudden illness. No, too obvious. Simply turn and run. No, her mother still had her arm in a death grip. She was trapped. Utterly, completely trapped. Very well, then. If fate had decided to humiliate her in front of the man she loved, she might as well face it with whatever dignity she could salvage. Charlotte straightened her shoulders and dropped into a curtsy that was technically correct, even if her horrendous dress bunched awkwardly around her knees. "Your Grace, my father didn't mention we'd be entertaining a duke today. Had I known, I might have dressed for the occasion." The words came out more tartly than she'd intended. Heat flooded her cheeks. Wonderful. Now she was being rude to a duke in addition to looking like an escaped scarecrow. But Alexander's smile only widened. "On the contrary, Lady Charlotte, I find your attire refreshingly honest." Honest? What an interesting word choice. "How diplomatic of you, Your Grace," Charlotte heard herself say. "Though I suspect your definition of honest is remarkably generous." Her mother's fingers tightened warningly on her arm. Her father made a small sound that might have been a cough or a laugh hastily converted into a cough. Alexander, however, laughed outright, a genuine, delighted sound that lit up his entire face. "I meant it as a compliment, Lady Charlotte. Half the ladies in Edinburgh spend hours preparing themselves for visitors, creating elaborate artifice. You apparently cannot be bothered with such nonsense." He said it like it was admirable, like her complete lack of preparation was somehow charming rather than mortifying. Charlotte stared at him, trying to understand what was happening. This wasn't how dukes behaved toward ordinary young ladies, especially not ordinary young ladies who looked like they'd been dragged backward through a hedge. She started, then stopped, unsure what to say. "Won't you sit down, Charlotte?" Her father interjected smoothly, gesturing toward the settee near the fireplace. "His Grace and I were just concluding some business regarding Highland tenant rights and the new land reforms. But there's no reason we cannot enjoy tea whilst we finish." Oh heavens! Tea. That meant she'd have to stay for at least half an hour, looking like this, with Alexander Sinclair watching her with that inexplicable expression of interest. Her mother finally released her arm, and Charlotte moved toward the indicated settee on legs that felt distinctly unsteady. She sat, arranging her hideous dress as best she could, hyper-aware of Alexander taking a seat in the chair directly across from her. He was still smiling at her. Why was he still smiling at her? A maid entered with the tea service, and Charlotte's mother began the ritual of pouring with practiced grace. The conversation resumed, her father and Alexander discussing something about agricultural improvements on the Duke's Highland estates, the complications of implementing fair rent assessments, the delicate balance between tradition and progress. "Your father's expertise in parliamentary procedure has been invaluable," Alexander said, accepting his teacup. "His guidance on navigating the Reform Act implications for Highland tenants may prevent considerable hardship." "My father knows a great deal about many things," Charlotte said carefully, wondering where this was leading. "As, apparently, does his daughter," Alexander replied, his dark blue eyes fixed on her. "Lord Pemberton mentioned you've been assisting with translations of Hungarian land reform documents. Your knowledge of languages is quite impressive." Charlotte felt Alexander's gaze return to her repeatedly as the men discussed crop rotation and irrigation systems. She tried to focus on her tea, tried to be invisible, tried to calculate the minimum amount of time before she could politely excuse herself and never show her face in civilized society again. Lady Charlotte, Alexander said suddenly, interrupting her father mid-sentence about drainage systems. I recall we once discussed Scottish history at the Cameron Highland gathering. Do you still read about the Jacobite period? He remembered. He remembered their conversation from 2 years ago. Charlotte looked up, teacup frozen halfway to her lips. Yes, Your Grace, though I confess my reading interests have expanded somewhat beyond that particular era. Oh, his dark eyes sparkled with genuine curiosity. What captures your interest these days? This felt like a trap. Men didn't actually want to know what women read. They wanted to hear about romantic novels or perhaps household management guides. But something in Alexander's expression, an openness, an authentic interest, made her answer honestly. I've been reading quite a bit of political philosophy recently. Adam Smith's work on economic theory. Some of Mary Wollstonecraft's essays as well. Her mother made a small pained sound. Her father's eyebrows rose nearly to his hairline. Alexander leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his entire attention focused on her with an intensity that made her heart race. She caught the scent of his cologne, something woody and expensive, cedar perhaps, mixed with something spicier she couldn't name. Wollstonecraft. A vindication of the rights of woman, I presume? Good heavens, Lady Charlotte. Those are rather radical texts for a young lady. Here it came. The polite dismissal, the subtle mockery. I've read it myself, Alexander continued, and Charlotte's head snapped up in shock. Her arguments about education are particularly compelling, don't you think? Though I suspect most of Edinburgh society would consider us both dangerous radicals for admitting as much. Charlotte blinked, then blinked again. You've read Mary Wollstonecraft? Why do you sound so surprised? Alexander's smile turned slightly mischievous. Did you assume dukes spent all their time hunting and gambling and discussing horse breeding? Well, yes, actually, Charlotte admitted before she could stop herself. He laughed again, that warm, genuine sound that did dangerous things to her composure. Fair enough. Most of us do. But I find books infinitely more interesting than horses, and philosophy more engaging than cards. This couldn't be real. This had to be some sort of elaborate dream, or perhaps a fever hallucination brought on by the stress of wearing this dreadful dress. Your Grace, Charlotte said carefully, are you quite well? Only you seem to be having an actual conversation with me about books, which in my experience is not something gentlemen do with ladies. Her mother gasped audibly. Her father looked torn between mortification and amusement. Alexander, blessed man, simply grinned. Perhaps you've been conversing with the wrong gentleman, Lady Charlotte. The afternoon dissolved into the strangest, most wonderful confusion of Charlotte's life. Her father and Alexander completed their business, something about irrigation systems and land management that ordinarily would have bored her to tears. But every few minutes, Alexander would direct a question to her, about books, about her opinions on the Reform Act debates, about whether she thought the railway expansion would fundamentally alter Scottish society, about her translation work with the Hungarian documents. He asked like he actually cared about her answers, like her thoughts mattered, like she was a person whose intelligence he respected rather than a decorative object to be admired and dismissed. And the way he looked at her, not at her hideous dress or her disastrous hair, but at her face, her eyes, as if she was the most fascinating person in the room. It was intoxicating, terrifying, completely inexplicable. An hour passed, then another. The afternoon light shifted through the windows, casting golden patterns on the Turkish carpet. Her mother had long since given up trying to steer the conversation toward more appropriate topics. Her father watched the exchange with an expression Charlotte couldn't quite interpret, something between satisfaction and careful assessment. Finally, Alexander rose to take his leave. Lord Pemberton, thank you for your time and counsel. I'm confident our collaborative approach to the Highland estates will prove most beneficial to the tenants. He turned to Charlotte's mother. Lady Pemberton, thank you for your hospitality. Then he looked at Charlotte, and his expression softened into something that made her heart perform impossible acrobatics. Lady Charlotte, this has been the most enjoyable afternoon I've spent in Edinburgh in, well, perhaps ever. Charlotte stood, her horrendous dress bunching awkwardly again, the scratchy wool suddenly feeling less like punishment and more like armor. Your Grace, I suspect you're being absurdly kind given that I look like I've been sleeping rough in Prince's Street Gardens. "I think," Alexander said quietly, his dark blue eyes holding hers with an intensity that made the room feel smaller. "You look like someone who doesn't waste time on pretense. It's remarkably attractive." He bowed to her, another proper, respectful bow. And then, just before he turned to follow her father toward the door, he said, "Lord Pemberton, might I have permission to call again? Specifically to continue my conversation with Lady Charlotte." The words hung in the air like bells. Charlotte felt the world tilt sideways. Her father's expression shifted to something calculating but not unkind. "Of course, Your Grace. You'd be most welcome." And then Alexander was gone, leaving Charlotte standing frozen in the drawing room, her mind reeling, her heart racing. The scratch of cheap wool against her skin suddenly the most wonderful sensation in the world, because it had somehow, impossibly, brought her this. Her mother moved to her side the moment the door closed, her expression a complicated mixture of disapproval and cautious hope. "Charlotte, what on earth was that?" "I have absolutely no idea," Charlotte admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Well," her mother said, straightening Charlotte's fallen curl with gentle fingers, "you certainly failed at being unremarkable. The Duke of Strathearn looked at you as if you'd hung the moon and stars. That was impossible. That was absurd. That was—" "Charlotte," her father called from the doorway, his voice serious. "Might I have a word?" She followed him back into his study on unsteady legs, her mind still trying to process what had just happened. He closed the door and leaned against his desk, studying her with that expression he got when examining a particularly complex political problem. "Did you know the Duke was visiting today?" he asked finally. "Absolutely not," Charlotte said. "If I had known, I would have." She gestured helplessly at her dress. "Well, I certainly wouldn't have looked like this." Her father's lips twitched. "The Duke seems remarkably unbothered by your creative fashion choices. In fact, I'd say he was rather enchanted." "I don't understand it," Charlotte confessed, sinking into the chair she'd occupied earlier. The leather was still warm from Alexander's presence, and she tried not to think about how pathetic that observation was. "He's the most eligible man in Scotland. He could have his pick of any lady, beautiful, accomplished, properly dressed ladies. Why would he possibly be interested in—" She couldn't finish the sentence. It was too painful. Her father moved closer, his expression gentling in a way it rarely did. "My dear girl, perhaps that's precisely why. Perhaps he's tired of beautiful, accomplished ladies who are performing for him. Perhaps he finds your authenticity refreshing." "Authenticity," Charlotte repeated flatly. "Is that what we're calling catastrophically underdressed and socially inappropriate?" "I'm calling it being yourself," her father said. "And apparently the Duke of Strathearn finds yourself rather captivating." "Charlotte, he specifically asked permission to call on you again. Not on the family generally, not for more political consultation. On you, specifically." Charlotte stared at her father, trying to make sense of words that contradicted everything she'd believed about her place in the world. "But why?" she whispered. "Perhaps," her father said gently, settling into the chair beside her, "because you treated him like a person rather than a title. You argued about philosophy. You were honest about your appearance rather than making excuses. You engaged his mind rather than flattering his consequence. My dear, you have no idea how rare that is for someone in his position." Charlotte looked down at her horrible gray dress, at the mismatched buttons and the crooked hem, and felt something shift inside her chest. Something that might have been hope. "He's coming back," she said, testing the words. "Tomorrow afternoon, if that's acceptable to you," her father confirmed. "And Charlotte, perhaps this time, or whatever makes you comfortable." Clearly, your instincts were better than anyone expected. Charlotte spent that evening in a state that could only be described as controlled panic. She tried to read, her usual refuge from overwhelming emotions, but found herself staring at the same paragraph of Smith's theory of moral sentiments for 20 minutes without comprehending a single word. Her mind kept replaying the afternoon's events like a music box stuck on the same melody. The way Alexander had looked at her, the way he'd laughed, the way he'd leaned forward when she spoke as if her words actually mattered, as if she herself mattered. It couldn't be real. Men like Alexander Sinclair didn't fall for women like her, especially not when she'd been dressed like an unemployed governess. At dinner, her mother tried to engage her in conversation about appropriate topics for tomorrow's call. Perhaps discuss the weather, deer, or inquire about his estates. But do try not to argue about philosophy. Men find that sort of thing unsettling in young ladies. But Charlotte barely tasted the roasted lamb on her plate, couldn't have said whether the wine was claret or burgundy. Her father watched her with that inscrutable expression he'd worn earlier, occasionally smiling into his wine glass in a way that suggested he found something about this situation deeply amusing. By the time she retired to her bedchamber, Charlotte had convinced herself that she'd imagined the entire thing. Alexander would send a polite note in the morning explaining that he'd been unexpectedly called away to his Highland estates, or London, or anywhere that wasn't here. Dukes didn't actually call on unremarkable earls' daughters just because they'd had one interesting conversation. That sort of thing happened in novels, not in real life. She was wrong. The next afternoon, at precisely 3 o'clock, their butler announced, "Your Grace, the Duke of Strathearn." Charlotte, who'd been attempting to appear casual while simultaneously perched on the edge of the drawing-room settee for the past 40 minutes, nearly dropped the book she'd been pretending to read. Her heart hammered against her ribs so forcefully she was certain everyone in the room could hear it. Alexander entered the room and stopped immediately, his dark blue eyes finding her with unnerving precision, his face lit with that same warm smile from yesterday. The smile that suggested he was genuinely pleased to see her, that he'd been thinking about this moment, that she wasn't merely an obligation or a passing curiosity. He was even more handsome than she remembered. Today he wore a charcoal gray coat that made his broad shoulders look impossibly wider, his dark hair slightly windswept, as if he'd been running his fingers through it. There was a slight crease between his brows that suggested he'd been concentrating on something serious just before arriving, reviewing estate papers, perhaps, or rehearsing what he planned to say. "Lady Charlotte," he said, his deep voice sending pleasant shivers down her spine. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Your Grace," Charlotte managed, standing and dropping into a curtsy. She'd chosen a dress today, a simple day dress in pale blue that Moira had insisted was perfectly appropriate without being overly formal, and actually allowed her maid to properly arrange her hair. The result was presentable, if not remarkable. She'd spent an hour that morning wondering if she'd made a mistake, if she should have worn something closer to yesterday's disaster to maintain. What? The illusion? The authenticity? She'd half expected Alexander to look disappointed when he saw her properly dressed, as if yesterday's disaster had held some bizarre appeal that today's respectability lacked. Instead, he looked thoughtful. His gaze traveled over her neat appearance, the properly pinned hair, the becoming dress, the careful attention to detail, and one eyebrow lifted slightly. "You look lovely, Lady Charlotte, though I confess I was rather charmed by yesterday's ensemble." Heat flooded her cheeks. "Your Grace, you're either remarkably kind or remarkably dishonest. That dress was a catastrophe." "It was honest," he said, moving closer, bringing with him that scent of cedar and spice that had haunted her dreams. "You wore exactly what you wanted to wear without caring what anyone thought. I found that rather liberating to witness." Her mother, who'd been sitting discreetly near the window with her embroidery, made a small, pleased sound. Alexander turned to her with impeccable politeness. "Lady Pemberton, I hope you'll forgive my requesting a few moments of your daughter's time. Perhaps a walk in your gardens? It's a remarkably pleasant afternoon." Charlotte's mother looked like Christmas had arrived early. "Of course, Your Grace. Charlotte, do take your shawl. The gardens are quite lovely this time of year, and there's a chill in the air." 2 minutes later, Charlotte found herself walking beside the Duke of Strathearn through her mother's prized rose garden, a proper chaperone. Her mother, watching from the drawing-room window at a distance that was technically appropriate, whilst being far enough away that their conversation would remain private. The October air was crisp, carrying the scent of late-blooming roses and the earthy smell of autumn settling in. For several moments, neither spoke. Charlotte's heart hammered so loudly she was certain Alexander could hear it. Their footsteps crunched on the gravel path. A bird sang somewhere in the hedges. The distant rumble of carriages on Charlotte Square mixed with the frantic rhythm of her pulse. This was bizarre. This was impossible. "I've been thinking about you since yesterday," Alexander said abruptly. Charlotte nearly tripped over her own feet. "I beg your pardon." He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious now, vulnerable in a way she'd never seen on a duke's face. "Lady Charlotte, I'm going to be remarkably forward with you, which may be inappropriate, but I suspect you'd prefer honesty to polite dancing around the subject. Yes, actually I would. Her voice came out steadier than she felt. Good. He took a breath, and Charlotte saw something she'd never expected to see on the face of Scotland's most eligible duke: nervousness. His hands clasped behind his back, then unclasped, then clasped again. I've attended approximately 50 social events these past 2 seasons. Balls, soirees, Highland gatherings, dinner parties. At each one, I've been surrounded by accomplished, beautiful young ladies who laugh at my jokes, agree with everything I say, and perform elaborate displays designed to catch my attention. Charlotte felt her heart sinking. Of course he was going to explain why those women were preferable to odd girls who wore horrible dresses. Of course this had been too good to be true. Of course. It's exhausting, Alexander continued, and Charlotte's head snapped up. Being constantly performed for. Never knowing if someone is genuinely interested in conversation or merely interested in becoming a duchess. I've spent 2 years feeling like an object to be acquired rather than a person to be known. Like my title is all that matters, and the man beneath it is irrelevant. He moved closer, and Charlotte's breath caught. And then yesterday, I walked into your father's study and saw you. Windswept hair, truly terrible dress, looking at me like you'd rather be literally anywhere else. And you were the most refreshing thing I'd seen in years. Refreshing, Charlotte repeated faintly. That's a diplomatic word for disastrous. No, Alexander said firmly, his eyes intense. Honest. Real. When I asked about your reading, you didn't pretend to only enjoy poetry or romantic novels. You told me you've been reading Mary Wollstonecraft and didn't care if I found it inappropriate. When I commented on your appearance, you didn't make excuses or simper. You practically called me a liar to my face. A surprised laugh escaped her despite the tension. That was appallingly rude of me. That was gloriously honest, he corrected. Lady Charlotte, do you know how many genuine conversations I've had with young ladies in the past 2 years? Conversations where they actually disagreed with me or challenged my opinions or said something unpredictable. Charlotte shook her head, unable to speak, afraid to hope. None, Alexander said flatly. Not one. Until yesterday. Until you. They'd reached a small bench beneath an arbor heavy with climbing roses, the last blooms of the season clinging stubbornly despite the autumn chill. Alexander gestured to it, and Charlotte sat, her mind reeling. He settled beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him despite the cool air, close enough that his cologne enveloped her. His hands rested on his knees, and she noticed they were trembling slightly. I'm not explaining this well, he admitted, his voice rough. I'm making it sound like I only value you for being different, which is reductive and unfair. The truth is, Lady Charlotte, I've been half in love with you since the Cameron Highland gathering 2 years ago. The world stopped. The birds ceased singing. The distant carriage sounds faded. Even her frantic heartbeat seemed to pause. What? The word emerged as barely a whisper. Alexander smiled ruefully, and in that smile she saw vulnerability, hope, fear, all the things she'd been feeling. We spoke for perhaps 15 minutes about the Jacobite risings. You quoted passages from historical accounts from memory and explained why you thought the romanticization of Bonnie Prince Charlie was historically inaccurate. You had opinions about Culloden that contradicted the accepted narrative, and you defended them with passion and evidence. You argued with me, genuinely argued, with intelligence and conviction, and I remember thinking, finally, someone interesting. Finally, someone real. But you left, Charlotte said, her voice cracking with 2 years of suppressed hurt. Lady Margaret arrived, and you left. You danced with her, with Eleanor Campbell, with Isabel MacLeod. You. She stopped, unable to continue. Because I was terrified, Alexander admitted, and the raw honesty in his voice made her look up. You were utterly captivating, and I was a young duke who'd been told my entire life that marriage was a strategic decision. My father died when I was 23, and his last words to me were about choosing a wife carefully, about alliances and bloodlines and duty. I convinced myself that attraction and genuine interest weren't sufficient foundation for courtship. I told myself I needed to be practical, to choose someone appropriate and accomplished and beautiful. Charlotte finished quietly, the word bitter on her tongue. You are beautiful, Alexander said with such fierce conviction that her head snapped up. Good God, Charlotte, you're beautiful. But more than that, you're brilliant and funny and honest, And you don't pretend to be less than you are to make men comfortable. You don't diminish your intelligence or hide your education or apologize for having opinions. You're exactly who you are, without artifice or performance, and that, his voice caught. That is extraordinary. Charlotte stared at him, trying to process words that contradicted everything she believed about herself for 2 years. The afternoon light caught the gold flecks in his dark blue eyes, and she saw nothing but sincerity there, nothing but truth. "Alexander," she said, using his Christian name without thinking, then immediately catching herself. "Your Grace, I've spent 2 years watching you dance with the most beautiful women in Scotland. Women who are charming and accomplished and elegant. Lady Isabel is considered the diamond of our generation. Eleanor Campbell paints like an angel and plays piano like a virtuoso. Margaret Fraser has family connections that span half of Europe. Why would you possibly?" "Because those women bore me senseless," he said bluntly, and the sheer honesty of it made her laugh despite herself. "I've danced with Lady Isabel MacLeod 8 times. She's never expressed a single opinion that wasn't carefully calculated to agree with whoever she was speaking to. She changes her views based on her audience like a chameleon. I've sat beside Miss Eleanor Campbell at 6 dinner parties. She speaks exclusively about the weather, her watercolors, and the appropriate way to arrange flowers. Lady Margaret, brilliant, beautiful Lady Margaret, once spent an entire evening telling me about her new bonnets. 30 minutes, Charlotte. 30 minutes about ribbons and feathers and French millinery." Despite herself, Charlotte laughed, a real laugh that felt like releasing something she'd held tight for too long. "I don't want a wife who performs for me," Alexander continued, his hand moving to cover hers on the bench between them. His touch was warm, gentle, achingly careful, as if she were something precious that might break. His thumb traced small circles on the back of her hand, and she felt that touch everywhere. "I don't want someone who sees me as a title to acquire. I don't want someone who agrees with everything I say and laughs at all my jokes and never challenges me to think differently. I want someone who argues about philosophy. Someone who wears terrible dresses when she can't be bothered with propriety. Someone who looks at me like I'm a person rather than a prize." His dark blue eyes held hers with an intensity that made her feel seen in a way she'd never experienced. "Someone like you, Charlotte." Charlotte looked down at their hands, at his long fingers covering hers, at the intimacy of the gesture that felt more significant than any kiss. Her throat felt tight with emotion, hope and fear and disbelief all tangled together. "I don't understand," she whispered. "Yesterday morning I was nobody. The Earl's ordinary daughter who'd failed to secure a husband after 2 seasons, who'd been declared unmarriageable after the Ashworth incident, who was too clever and too opinionated and too," her voice broke, "too everything and not enough simultaneously. And now you're saying, you were never nobody," Alexander said fiercely, his free hand coming up to her chin, gently turning her face so she had to look at him. "Never. You were always remarkable. You were always extraordinary. I was simply too much of a coward to pursue what I actually wanted instead of what everyone expected me to want. I wasted 2 years dancing with women I didn't care about, having conversations that meant nothing, trying to convince myself that duty mattered more than happiness." His thumb brushed across her cheek, and Charlotte realized with surprise that there were tears there. "And all that time, you were right there, and I was too blind, too scared, too concerned with propriety and expectations to see what was in front of me. And what do you see now?" The question emerged barely above a whisper, barely more than breath. Alexander's dark blue eyes searched hers, and what she saw there made her heart stop and restart with a different rhythm. "I see the woman I should have pursued 2 years ago. I see someone who makes me laugh and makes me think and makes me want to be honest rather than diplomatic. I see someone who I could talk to for hours and never grow bored. Someone who challenges me and excites me and," he took a shaky breath, "someone I could love for the rest of my life." The words hung between them, precious and terrifying and impossibly real. "Alexander," Charlotte breathed, and saying his name felt like crossing some invisible boundary, like stepping into a new version of herself. "May I court you?" he asked softly, formally, his voice carrying the weight of something sacred. "Properly, openly, with your parents' blessing and society's knowledge. May I take you walking in Prince's Street gardens and escort you to the assembly rooms and bore you with agricultural discussions about Highland sheep farming and irrigation systems? May I bring you books and argue with you about philosophy and spend afternoons learning everything about you?" His hand still held hers, warm and solid and real. "May I prove to you, Charlotte, that I'm serious about this? That you're not a passing fancy or a temporary fascination, but exactly what I've been looking for without knowing it?" Charlotte laughed through her tears, the sound shaky but genuine. "You're serious? You're actually serious about this?" "Devastatingly serious," he confirmed, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "Say yes, Charlotte. Give me the chance to prove I'm worthy of 2 years of your secret affection. Give me the opportunity to show you that I see you, truly see you, and find you absolutely perfect exactly as you are." Charlotte looked at him, really looked at him. At the nervous hope in his eyes, the vulnerability in his expression, the slight tremor in his hands. This wasn't the Duke of Strathearn, Scotland's most eligible bachelor, the man every mother wanted for her daughter. This was just Alexander, as nervous and hopeful and terrified as she was. There were 1,000 reasons to be cautious, to protect her heart, to question his motivations, to wonder if this was some elaborate dream from which she'd wake devastated. But Alexander was looking at her like she was precious, like she mattered, like she was enough exactly as she was. "Yes," Charlotte whispered, then stronger. "Yes, Alexander, you may court me." His smile could have powered every gas lamp in Edinburgh. Thank God. I was prepared to grovel if necessary. I had a whole speech planned about Highland sunsets and the philosophical implications of authentic connection. "I would have enjoyed watching that," Charlotte admitted, laughing. "I'm certain you would have." He stood, helping her to her feet, but didn't immediately release her hand. "Now, shall we inform your parents that I've utterly lost my senses and intend to pursue their brilliant, argumentative, wonderfully honest daughter? They'll think you've gone mad." "Excellent," Alexander said cheerfully, tucking her hand into the crook of his arm as they walked back toward the house. "I've always wanted to be the source of scandalized gossip. It builds character." Through the drawing room window, Charlotte could see her mother watching them with an expression of barely contained excitement. Her father had joined her, and both parents wore matching expressions of hopeful curiosity. "Alexander," Charlotte said as they approached the terrace, needing to voice the fear before it consumed her. "What happens when you realize I'm not actually extraordinary? When the novelty of my honesty wears off and you remember that there are dozens of beautiful, accomplished ladies who'd make much more suitable duchesses?" He stopped walking and turned to face her, his expression serious. "Charlotte, I've spent 2 years surrounded by those ladies. I know exactly what they offer: beauty, accomplishment, appropriate connections, perfect propriety. I know it intimately because I've been evaluating it, measuring it, trying to convince myself it was enough." His hands came up to frame her face, his touch gentle but firm. "What I don't know, what I'm desperate to discover, is everything about you. Your favorite books and your least favorite social obligations. Whether you can play the pianoforte or if you share my complete inability to carry a tune. What you dream about. What makes you laugh at inappropriate moments. What you think about when you're alone. How you take your tea. What subjects make you argue most passionately. Every mundane and extraordinary detail that makes you who you are." He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers. "The novelty won't wear off, Charlotte, because you're not a novelty. You're a person, complex and fascinating and real. And I want to spend years discovering all of you." Charlotte felt fresh tears prick her eyes. "I'm a terrible musician," she confessed. "Absolutely dreadful. I once made my music teacher quit by attempting Beethoven." "Perfect," Alexander said, his smile returning. "We can be dreadful together. I have hidden depths of incompetence that will astound you." They entered the drawing room to find both of Charlotte's parents waiting with barely concealed curiosity. Her mother's embroidery lay forgotten in her lap. Her father had emerged from his study and stood by the fireplace, trying to appear casual whilst clearly desperate to know what had transpired in the garden. Alexander addressed them formally, but Charlotte could see the suppressed joy in every line of his body. "Lord Pemberton, Lady Pemberton, I've had the honor of requesting permission to formally court your daughter. With your blessing, I'd like to call upon Lady Charlotte regularly and escort her to appropriate social engagements." Charlotte's mother looked like she might faint from happiness. Her father's expression shifted to something more calculating. not suspicious, but protective. The expression of a man who loved his daughter and wanted to ensure she'd be treated well. "Your Grace," the Earl said carefully, "might I ask what your intentions are regarding my daughter?" "Honorable," Alexander said immediately, without hesitation. "Completely honorable. I intend to court Lady Charlotte properly, to give her time to determine whether my regard is returned, and should she find me acceptable." He paused, and Charlotte saw him swallow hard. "Should she find me acceptable, to eventually request her hand in marriage." The words hung in the air like bells. Marriage. Alexander had just announced his intention to marry her, right there in her parents' drawing room, with the afternoon sun streaming through the windows and her mother clutching her embroidery like a lifeline. Charlotte felt lightheaded. Her vision narrowed to Alexander's profile, serious and sincere as he addressed her father. Her father studied Alexander for a long moment, then glanced at Charlotte. Whatever he saw in her expression, the joy, the terror, the desperate hope, must have satisfied him because he nodded slowly. "Very well, Your Grace. You have my permission to court Charlotte. However, I expect you to treat her with appropriate respect and consideration. She's had quite enough of society's judgment already, and I won't have her heart broken by someone he paused meaningfully, by someone she's regarded highly for some time." Alexander's eyes widened slightly, and he glanced at Charlotte. She felt her cheeks burn. Her father knew. Of course he knew. Parents always knew. "I wouldn't dream of doing otherwise," Alexander assured him, his voice solemn. "Lord Pemberton, your daughter is the most remarkable woman I've met. I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate that she's given me this opportunity." Her mother had apparently lost the ability to speak and simply nodded enthusiastically, tears streaming down her face. Alexander stayed for another hour, taking tea and engaging in conversation that was perfectly proper and appropriate, while simultaneously catching Charlotte's eye repeatedly and smiling like they shared a wonderful secret. Which, Charlotte supposed, they did. They shared 2 years of watching each other from afar, 2 years of secret longing, 2 years of believing they'd never have this. When he finally took his leave, he bowed over Charlotte's hand and held it perhaps a moment longer than strictly necessary. The sapphire in his signet ring caught the light, and Charlotte found herself memorizing every detail. The warmth of his hand, the scent of cedar and spice, the way his thumb brushed across her knuckles in a gesture so subtle her parents wouldn't have noticed, but that sent electricity through her entire body. "Tomorrow afternoon," he said, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Might I take you driving in Prince's Street Gardens? Around 4 o'clock, when all of society will be present to witness the Duke of Strathearn courting the incomparable Lady Charlotte Pemberton." "You want to make a spectacle?" Charlotte realized. "I want everyone to know," Alexander corrected, his dark blue eyes intense. "I've wasted 2 years. I'm not wasting another moment hiding what I want. And what I want, Charlotte, is for all of Edinburgh to understand that you are mine and I am yours." After he left, Charlotte's mother immediately burst into excited chatter about what Charlotte should wear for Prince's Street Gardens, which bonnets would be most flattering, which shawls would best complement which dresses. But Charlotte barely heard her. She was still standing in the entrance hall, staring at the door through which Alexander had departed, her hand still tingling from his touch. Her father caught her eye and gestured toward his study. She followed, grateful for a moment of relative quiet. "Are you certain about this, my dear?" he asked gently once the door was closed. "The Duke is, well, he's rather overwhelming. His attentions will come with considerable public scrutiny. Society hasn't forgotten the Ashworth incident, and there will be those who question his choice, who'll say cruel things about why he selected you over more appropriate matches." "I know," Charlotte said quietly. "But Papa, I've loved him for 2 years. I know that sounds ridiculous, that it's the sort of thing silly girls say in novels, but—" "It doesn't sound ridiculous at all," her father interrupted. "I fell in love with your mother after one dance. These things happen, Charlotte. The heart doesn't follow rational timelines." He paused, his expression serious. "But love alone isn't always sufficient for happiness. Can you trust him? Can you trust that his regard is genuine, that he won't wake up in 6 months and regret choosing Edinburgh's most notorious bluestocking?" Charlotte thought about Alexander's nervous confession in the garden, about the loneliness in his eyes when he spoke about being constantly performed for, about the way he'd looked at her in her terrible dress and seen something worth pursuing. About the tremor in his hands when he'd asked to court her, about the raw honesty in every word he'd spoken. "Yes," she said quietly. "I can trust him. He's as lonely as I've been, Papa, just for different reasons. He spent 2 years surrounded by people whilst being completely isolated, performing his role whilst hiding who he actually is. I understand that. And I think," her voice caught, "I think he sees me the same way I see him. Not the Earl's daughter or the Duke. Just Charlotte and Alexander, two people who want to be known rather than admired." Her father pulled her into a hug, rare for him, which made it even more precious. "Then I'm happy for you, darling girl. Though I suspect your mother is already planning a wedding that will bankrupt us all." Charlotte laughed against his shoulder. "I haven't even properly courted yet." "Details," her father said dryly. "Minor, insignificant details to your mother." That night, Charlotte lay in bed staring at the ceiling, her mind replaying every word, every gesture, every smile from the afternoon. Tomorrow she would ride through Prince's Street Gardens beside Alexander Sinclair, and all of Edinburgh would see. All those beautiful ladies who danced with him would witness the Duke of Strathearn courting the Earl's unremarkable daughter. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, she felt something that might have been triumph. She'd worn her worst dress and captured the heart of the man she loved. If that wasn't proof that honesty was its own reward, Charlotte didn't know what was. Tomorrow the Real challenge would begin, learning to believe she deserved this impossible happiness. But tonight, she'd allow herself the luxury of joy. The scandal broke over Edinburgh society like a Highland storm approximately 17 minutes after Alexander and Charlotte's first public appearance in Prince's Street Gardens. Charlotte had worried about her dress, a lovely but unremarkable lavender walking dress that Moira had insisted was perfect, the color bringing out her eyes without being ostentatious. She'd worried about her bonnet, a simple straw affair with modest ribbon trim in a slightly darker purple. She'd worried about what to say, how to walk properly beside a duke, whether she'd somehow humiliate herself in front of half the Scottish aristocracy. She'd spent an hour that morning practicing in her room, trying to master the art of climbing into a carriage gracefully, of arranging her skirts just so, of maintaining appropriate posture while appearing relaxed. She had not anticipated the sheer spectacle that was Alexander Sinclair courting someone openly. He arrived at precisely 4 o'clock in a carriage that was clearly designed to be noticed, glossy black lacquer polished to a mirror shine, with the Strathearn crest emblazoned on the doors in silver and blue, pulled by perfectly matched grays that probably cost more than most people's houses. The horse's manes had been braided with blue ribbons. Even the driver wore immaculate livery. Alexander himself looked devastatingly handsome in a dark blue coat and buff-colored breeches, his dark hair artfully windswept in that way that Charlotte suspected actually required considerable effort. His cravat was tied in an elaborate style she didn't recognize, held with a sapphire pin that matched his eyes. He carried a small bouquet of late-season roses, not the elaborate arrangement most gentlemen presented, but a simple, elegant gathering that somehow felt more personal. He handed her into the carriage with exquisite care, his touch lingering on her gloved hand a moment longer than necessary, his fingers warm even through the fabric. "You look beautiful," he murmured low enough that only she could hear, his breath warm against her ear. "I look perfectly ordinary," Charlotte corrected, settling her skirts, hyper-aware of her mother watching from the window. "You look like yourself," Alexander said, climbing up beside her and taking the reins. The leather creaked as he settled into place, and Charlotte caught that scent of cedar and spice again, mixing now with the smell of horse and leather and autumn air, which makes you considerably more interesting than anyone else we're about to encounter. Prince's Street Gardens at 4 o'clock on a pleasant October afternoon was a crush of elegant carriages, immaculate horses, and society's most fashionable members displaying themselves like peacocks in full plumage. The path around the park was so crowded that progress was necessarily slow, which, Charlotte realized with creeping horror, meant everyone would have ample time to stare. And stare they did. Charlotte recognized dozens of faces, ladies from her previous seasons, gentlemen who danced with her once and never asked again, matrons whose approval could make or break a young lady's reputation. She saw Mrs. Beatrice Ashworth, Edinburgh's most notorious gossip, actually lean out of her barouche to get a better view. She spotted Lord Ashworth himself, the man whose pride she'd wounded, watching them with an expression she couldn't quite read. Every single one of them stopped talking when Alexander's carriage entered the gardens. The effect was like a wave, conversations dying, heads turning, fans pausing mid-flutter. Even the sound of hoofbeats seemed to quiet, as if the entire park was holding its breath. "Oh dear," Charlotte muttered, her hands tightening on the edge of the seat. "This is rather dramatic." "Wait for it," Alexander said cheerfully, guiding the horses into the fashionable circuit around the park. His voice carried that tone of barely suppressed amusement that suggested he was enjoying this immensely. Lady Fraser nearly drove her barouche into a tree, gaping at them with an expression of pure shock. Miss Eleanor Campbell, one of the beautiful ladies Alexander had danced with countless times, stood frozen on the walking path beside her mother, staring with a mixture of disbelief and dawning horror. Lady Isabel MacLeod, resplendent in a riding habit of deep emerald that probably cost more than Charlotte's entire wardrobe, pulled her magnificent bay mare to a complete stop and simply watched them pass with narrowed, calculating eyes. "Everyone is staring," Charlotte hissed, trying to keep her smile in place even as her cheeks burned. "Excellent," Alexander said, nodding politely to a cluster of dowagers whose expressions suggested they were witnessing something scandalous. Mrs. Henderson, Mrs. Blackwood, and the fearsome Lady Carmichael, Edinburgh's self-appointed moral arbiters, huddled together like a coven, their fans moving rapidly despite the cool air. "That's rather the point." "The point of what?" "Making it clear that I'm unavailable," Alexander explained, steering them past Lord and Lady Hamilton's elegant phaeton. Lady Hamilton's mouth had actually fallen open in a most undignified manner. "I've spent 2 years being diplomatically evasive about my marital intentions, Charlotte. This," he gestured between them with his free hand, "is me being explicitly clear about where my interests lie." An elderly gentleman Charlotte didn't recognize actually removed his hat and bowed deeply as they passed, a gesture of respect that made her throat tight. Alexander returned it with perfect aristocratic dignity while simultaneously murmuring to Charlotte, "That's Lord Rothwell. He'll tell at least 20 people about this before dinner. Probably write to half his correspondents in London as well. By next week, the betting books at White's will reflect our courtship." "You're enjoying this," Charlotte realized, watching his profile. There was a slight curve to his mouth, a spark of mischief in his eyes that made him look younger, less burdened. "You're actually enjoying creating a scandal." "Not a scandal," Alexander corrected, glancing at her with warmth that made her breath catch. "A statement. There's a difference. Scandals are shameful secrets. Statements are public declarations. I'm declaring that you matter to me, that my choice is deliberate and considered, that anyone who doubts your worth will have to contend with me." He paused, his voice dropping to something more intimate. "Are you uncomfortable? We can leave if you'd prefer. Just say the word, and I'll have us back at Charlotte Square in 5 minutes." Charlotte considered. She'd spent 2 years being invisible, being overlooked, being considered unremarkable and unmarriageable. Now the Duke of Strathearn was publicly claiming her attention in front of everyone who'd dismissed her, everyone who'd written her off after the Ashworth incident, everyone who'd assumed she'd die a spinster with her books and her opinions. Part of her wanted to shrink down, to make herself small, to apologize for taking up space in Alexander's life. But a larger part, the part that had worn the gray dress, the part that had refused to apologize to Lord Ashworth, the part that had argued about philosophy and admitted to reading Wollstonecraft, felt something else entirely. Pride. Defiance. A fierce, bright joy. "No," she said slowly, straightening her spine and lifting her chin. "I think I'm rather enjoying it too." Alexander's answering smile was brilliant, transforming his whole face. "There's my brave girl." They completed one circuit of the park, then another. Each pass generated more whispers, more stares, more barely concealed shock. Charlotte heard fragments of conversation as they passed. The Earl's daughter, the one who corrected Ashworth. Been 2 years since anyone courted her seriously. What can he possibly see in? Heard she reads philosophy, of all things. Dreadfully inappropriate choice. But there were other voices too. Rather sweet, actually. She did nothing wrong with Ashworth. Man's a pompous. Bright girl, always liked her. Good for Strathearn, needs someone with substance. Alexander remained perfectly composed throughout, acknowledging acquaintances with polite nods whilst keeping his attention primarily on Charlotte. He asked about her opinions on the autumn weather, whether she thought the new plantings near the fountain were an improvement over last year's arrangements, if she'd read the latest installment of Dickens's serialized novel in household words, what she thought about the proposed railway expansion to Aberdeen. Perfectly ordinary conversation that was made remarkable simply by who was having it, and by the fact that Alexander genuinely listened to her answers, asked follow-up questions, looked at her like her thoughts actually mattered. On their third circuit, they encountered the inevitable confrontation. Lady Margaret Fraser, diamond of last season, possessor of perfect blonde ringlets and a smile that had launched 1,000 marriage proposals, positioned her elegant barouche directly in their path, forcing Alexander to stop. She wore a riding habit of deep burgundy that set off her fair complexion perfectly, with rubies at her throat that caught the afternoon sun like drops of blood. "Your Grace," Lady Margaret said, her voice carrying that particular tone of aristocratic sweetness that Charlotte had learned meant trouble. Honey poured over knives. "What a surprise to see you. And Lady Charlotte. How unexpected." Charlotte caught the emphasis on unexpected, the suggestion that her presence was somehow shocking, inappropriate, incomprehensible. "Lady Margaret," Alexander replied with perfect politeness, but Charlotte noticed his jaw tighten slightly. "Lovely afternoon, isn't it?" Lady Margaret's blue eyes flickered between them, calculating, measuring. Charlotte could practically see her mind working, trying to understand what game was being played. "Indeed, Your Grace. I believe you'd promised me a turn in the gardens. Was that not mentioned at the Hamilton soiree last week?" Charlotte's stomach dropped. She'd been at that soiree, had watched from across the room as Alexander danced with Margaret, had seen them talking together on the terrace afterward. "I believe you may be misremembering," Alexander said smoothly, but his voice had cooled by several degrees. "I made no such commitment." The lie was polite but obvious to anyone paying attention. Charlotte had seen them together, had watched Margaret laugh at something Alexander said, had witnessed what looked like an intimate moment between two people who understood each other's world in ways Charlotte never could. Lady Margaret's smile froze, becoming a brittle thing that didn't reach her eyes. "I see. How interesting that your memory differs from mine." "Memory is a fallible thing," Alexander agreed, his tone suggesting the conversation was over. "Lady Charlotte," Lady Margaret interrupted, turning her attention fully to Charlotte with an expression that suggested a cat evaluating a particularly small mouse. Her eyes swept over Charlotte's simple lavender dress, her modest bonnet, her unadorned gloves. "I don't believe we've been properly introduced, though we've certainly seen each other at various events over the years. You've been rather quiet during the past few seasons, haven't you?" The implication was clear, unremarkable, forgettable, beneath notice. The kind of girl who blended into wallpaper, who occupied chairs at balls without being asked to dance, who existed on the periphery of society without ever being truly part of it. Something in Charlotte snapped. Perhaps it was 2 years of swallowing similar barbs. Perhaps it was the feel of Alexander's solid presence beside her, a reminder that someone saw her differently. Perhaps it was the scratch of yesterday's gray wool still vivid in her memory, a reminder that authenticity had brought her here. Perhaps it was simply that she was exhausted with pretending to be invisible, with accepting society's judgment of her worth. "Quiet, yes," Charlotte agreed pleasantly, keeping her voice level despite her racing heart. "I found that silence often reveals more than conversation, Lady Margaret. One notices the most fascinating things when one simply observes rather than performs." Lady Margaret's perfect smile tightened almost imperceptibly. "Indeed? And what fascinating things have you observed?" Charlotte could feel Alexander's attention on her, could sense him preparing to intervene if needed, but she plunged forward anyway. "Oh, countless things. For instance, I've observed that some people confuse attention with genuine interest. That desperation, no matter how beautifully packaged, remains desperation. That manufactured charm is considerably less appealing than authentic character." She met Margaret's gaze directly, refusing to look away. "I've noticed that truly confident people don't need to diminish others to feel important. That real connections are built on honesty rather than performance. That a man of true substance values depth over decoration." Alexander made a sound that might have been a cough or a suppressed laugh. Around them, Charlotte could sense other carriages slowing, people leaning in to hear better. This conversation would be repeated in every drawing room in Edinburgh by nightfall. Lady Margaret's face flushed pink beneath her powder, two spots of color appearing high on her cheeks. "How extraordinarily rude, Lady Charlotte. Your Grace, surely you don't condone such." "I find Lady Charlotte's honesty refreshing," Alexander interrupted, his voice carrying an edge of steel beneath the polite tone, a warning that made several nearby observers go silent. "She has a remarkable gift for identifying pretense and calling it what it is. It's one of the many qualities I admire in her." He paused, his eyes hard on Margaret in a way Charlotte had never seen. "Now, if you'll truly excuse us, Lady Margaret, we have other engagements. I'm certain you understand." He guided the horses past Lady Margaret's barouche with deliberate care, leaving the diamond of last season staring after them with an expression that promised retribution, and Charlotte thought she saw in that unguarded moment genuine hurt. For just a flash, Margaret's carefully constructed mask had slipped, revealing something raw underneath. She had loved him, Charlotte realized with a pang of guilt. Perhaps not as Charlotte did, but in her own way. Then the mask returned, and Margaret turned her barouche with jerky movements, calling to her driver in a voice that carried across the garden. Once they were out of earshot, Alexander turned to Charlotte, his expression transformed from cold disapproval to warm admiration. "That was magnificent. Absolutely magnificent." "That was appalling," Charlotte corrected, her heart still racing, her hands trembling slightly in her lap. "I was unspeakably rude to her." "She was condescending to you first," Alexander pointed out, "and planning to be far worse. I know Margaret Fraser. I've danced with her enough times, sat through enough conversations where she subtly demolished other ladies' reputations. You simply refuse to accept her attempt to put you in your place. There's a difference between defending yourself and being cruel. The ton will crucify me for it." Charlotte could already imagine the conversations. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, that unmarriageable bluestocking, being unspeakably rude to her betters, showing her true colors, proving she's unfit for society. "The ton," Alexander said firmly, "can go hang. Besides, within a week you'll be seen as witty rather than rude. That's how these things work when you're courting a duke, Charlotte. My consequence protects you, elevates your words from impertinence to clever repartee. It's deeply unfair, but we might as well use it to your advantage." He said it so matter-of-factly that Charlotte almost believed him. Almost. They completed 2 more circuits, during which at least 6 more people stopped them to exchange pleasantries that were thinly veiled fishing expeditions for information. Lord Hamilton wanted to know about Alexander's Highland estates, and also happened to mention his unmarried daughter. Mrs. Ashworth openly stared at Charlotte while pretending to discuss the weather. The dowagers at least showed some restraint, but their curiosity was palpable. Through it all, Alexander remained steadfast at Charlotte's side, his hand occasionally brushing hers in the seat between them. Small touches that could have been accidental but felt deliberate, grounding her in the moment. Before Alexander finally guided them out of the park, he turned to Charlotte with an expression that was part mischief, part sincerity. "There's someone I'd like you to meet, if you're not too exhausted by all of this." "Who?" Charlotte asked, curious despite her frayed nerves. "My aunt, Lady Agnes Sinclair. She's been living with me since my father died, and she's been absolutely desperate to meet you since I mentioned I was courting someone. She lives at my Edinburgh residence on Moray Place." "You told your aunt about me?" Charlotte felt a flutter of something, nervousness, hope, fear all tangled together. "I told everyone about you," Alexander said, steering the carriage toward Newtown. "My steward at Strathearn Castle, my secretary, the butler, the cook. I believe I may have mentioned you to my horse as well. I've been rather enthusiastic." Charlotte laughed despite her nervousness. "Your horse must have been fascinated." "Perseus is an excellent listener," Alexander said seriously. "He rarely interrupts, and he never judges. Unlike most of Edinburgh society. The Strathearn Edinburgh townhouse was elegant but not ostentatious. A 4-story building on Moray Place with perfectly maintained gardens and an air of quiet wealth that didn't need to announce itself. The stone was honey-colored in the afternoon sun, the windows tall and welcoming. Smoke rose from 2 chimneys, suggesting warmth and life inside. A footman appeared immediately as they pulled up, taking charge of the horses whilst Alexander helped Charlotte down. His hands lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary, steadying her, and she was grateful because her legs felt unsteady after the tension of the park. "Nervous?" he asked quietly, his face close to hers. "Terrified," Charlotte admitted. "Your aunt is going to think you've lost your mind." "My aunt," Alexander said, leading her up the steps with his hand at the small of her back, "is going to adore you. She's been telling me for 2 years that I need to find someone with substance rather than just beauty. Someone who'll challenge me rather than flatter me. Someone real." The interior of the townhouse was beautiful. High ceilings with ornate moldings, elegant artwork that suggested generations of accumulated wealth, but somehow it felt lived in rather than like a museum. Books scattered on side tables, a half-finished embroidery project on a chair near the fireplace, fresh flowers in vases that looked recently arranged rather than formally displayed. It felt like a home, not just a showplace. "Alexander," a woman's voice called from the drawing room, warm and slightly impatient. "Is that you? Did you bring her? You promised you'd bring her. I've been watching from the window for the past hour like some lovesick girl." A moment later, a woman swept into the entrance hall and stopped, staring at Charlotte with undisguised curiosity. Lady Agnes Sinclair was perhaps 50, with graying hair arranged fashionably but not severely, and kind eyes that reminded Charlotte distinctly of Alexander's. That same intense blue, that same direct gaze. She wore a day dress of deep green that was elegant without being fussy, clearly expensive but chosen for comfort rather than show. "Aunt Agnes," Alexander said formally, though his tone was warm with genuine affection. "May I present Lady Charlotte Pemberton?" "Charlotte, my aunt, Lady Agnes Sinclair." "Oh, she's perfect," Lady Agnes said immediately, abandoning all pretense of formal introduction to clasp Charlotte's hands warmly. Her grip was firm, her hands slightly rough, not the hands of a lady who spent her days embroidering and taking tea. "Absolutely perfect." "Alexander, you didn't mention she had such intelligent eyes." "I mentioned several things about her," Alexander protested, but he was smiling. Yes, clever and honest and reads philosophy." His aunt waved dismissively, still holding Charlotte's hands and studying her face with unnerving intensity. "But you didn't mention the eyes. Very important eyes. They show everything. Intelligence, character, humor. Can't fake good eyes." She pulled Charlotte toward the drawing room, her grip surprisingly strong. "Come, my dear, tell me absolutely everything. How did you capture my nephew's attention? He's been impervious to every eligible lady in Scotland for 2 years, and believe me, they've tried. I've watched a parade of accomplished beauties throw themselves at him with increasing desperation." Charlotte found herself seated on a comfortable sofa, worn leather that molded to her shape, clearly a favorite sitting spot, whilst Lady Agnes poured tea from a simple but elegant service. Alexander settled in a nearby chair, watching the interaction with an expression of poorly concealed satisfaction, like a man watching his favorite people get along exactly as he'd hoped. "I wore a terrible dress," Charlotte finally explained, succumbing to Lady Agnes's persistent interrogation. The older woman had a way of asking questions that made evasion feel rude. "The worst dress you've ever seen. Gray and shapeless and absolutely dreadful. Cheap wool that scratched, mismatched buttons, a crooked hem. I decided I couldn't be bothered impressing whatever tedious visitor my father was entertaining." Lady Agnes laughed delightedly, a sound like bells that filled the room. "And instead, you accidentally impressed a duke. That's wonderfully ironic. The universe has a sense of humor." "That's what I thought," Charlotte admitted. "I still don't entirely understand it." "Don't you?" Lady Agnes glanced at Alexander with knowing eyes, then back to Charlotte. "My dear, Alexander has spent 2 years being performed for by women who see him as a title rather than a person. Every smile calculated, every laugh timed perfectly, every opinion carefully crafted to agree with whatever he's just said. You treated him like he was ordinary, like his title didn't matter, like he had to earn your attention through genuine conversation rather than simply expecting it because of his consequence." She leaned forward, her expression serious now. "That's intoxicating to someone who's spent his entire life being treated as extraordinary for no reason except his birth. You offered him something none of those beautiful, accomplished ladies could: authenticity. The real you, unfiltered and unperforming. That's rarer than diamonds, child." "But he is extraordinary," Charlotte protested, then immediately blushed at her own vehemence. Alexander's expression softened into something that made Charlotte's chest tight. "See, and Agnes," he said quietly. "She argues, even when complimenting me. It's absolutely marvelous." They spent 2 hours in Lady Agnes's drawing room, and Charlotte discovered she genuinely enjoyed the older woman's company. The conversation flowed easily from books to politics to a lengthy discussion about whether the railway expansion would fundamentally alter Scottish commerce and society. Lady Agnes held her own in the debate, revealing a sharp political mind and a wry sense of humor that reminded Charlotte distinctly of Alexander. At one point, when Alexander excused himself to speak with his steward about some Highland matter, Lady Agnes leaned closer to Charlotte and said quietly, "I was engaged once, you know." Charlotte looked up, surprised by the sudden shift in tone. 30 years ago, Lady Agnes continued, her eyes distant. "William Morrison, second son of an earl, very handsome, absolutely brilliant. We were planning a spring wedding." She smiled, but her eyes held old sadness. "He died of fever 2 weeks before our wedding. I watched him waste away, helpless to do anything." "I'm so sorry," Charlotte said softly, meaning it. "I tell you this not for sympathy," Lady Agnes said, her gaze sharpening, "but so you understand why I'm so invested in Alexander's happiness. I've lived vicariously through him ever since he was born, my brother's only son, the heir to everything. When his father died and Alexander became Duke at 23, I moved in to help him navigate it all. I've watched him carry the weight of duty for years, always doing what's expected rather than what he wants." She took Charlotte's hand. "So you'll forgive me for being perhaps overly enthusiastic about this courtship. It's the first time I've seen him choose something for himself. Choose someone who makes him laugh, who challenges him, who treats him like a person rather than a walking title. I don't know if I can be what he needs," Charlotte admitted, voicing the fear that had been gnawing at her. "A duchess requires so many skills I don't possess, running large households, navigating court politics, managing estates, representing the family at state functions. What if I fail him?" Lady Agnes squeezed her hand. "My dear child, do you know what the most important quality is in a duchess?" Charlotte shook her head. "The ability to be a true partner to the Duke. Everything else, the household management, the social graces, the political maneuvering, all of that can be learned. But genuine partnership, real companionship, authentic love, that can't be taught. Either it's there or it isn't." She smiled. "And from what I've seen in the past 2 hours, you and Alexander have that. The rest will follow." When Alexander returned, they spent another hour discussing his Highland estates, the challenges of implementing fair farming practices, the delicate balance between tradition and progress, the complicated politics of tenant relationships. Charlotte found herself genuinely interested, asking questions that seemed to surprise and delight both Alexander and his aunt. Finally, as the afternoon stretched toward evening and the light began to fade, Alexander escorted Charlotte home. They rode in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing the events of the day. At her parents' doorstep, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his thumb tracing patterns on her glove. "Tomorrow evening, there's a dinner party at the MacLeod estate," he said quietly, his expression growing serious. "I'd like to escort you. Fair warning, Charlotte, it will be considerably less pleasant than today. Various people will be unpleasant to you because they're jealous or confused or simply cruel for entertainment. Lady Isabel will be there, and she's not going to take our courtship well. Margaret will likely attend as well, and after today's confrontation, she'll be out for blood." "And you want me to attend anyway?" Charlotte asked, searching his face. "I want you beside me," Alexander corrected, his voice fervent. "But I won't force you into uncomfortable situations. If you'd prefer to wait until society adjusts to us courting, until the gossip dies down, I'll understand. We can take this slower. Let people get used to the idea." "No," Charlotte interrupted, surprised by her own certainty. "If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. I won't hide. I won't apologize for existing in your life. Let them say what they will. I'm done shrinking to make other people comfortable." Alexander's smile could have lit Edinburgh. "That's my brave girl." He brought her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles that she felt through the glove, through her skin, straight to her racing heart. Then he was gone, leaving Charlotte standing on the doorstep with her heart racing and her future suddenly impossibly bright. Her mother pounced the moment she entered the house. Tell me everything. Every single detail. What did people say? Was everyone staring? Did anyone cut you? Did the Duke? Mama, breathe. Charlotte laughed, pulling off her gloves. It was intense and wonderful and terrifying. Her father emerged from his study, his expression concerned but curious. Charlotte, are you well? I'm courting the Duke of Strathearn, Charlotte said, testing the words. Half of Edinburgh watched it happen. Lady Margaret Fraser was unpleasant, and I was rude in return. Alexander's aunt thinks I'm perfect, and tomorrow we're attending a dinner party where people will likely be even more unpleasant. She paused, realizing something fundamental had shifted. And I don't care. For the first time in 2 years, Papa, I genuinely don't care what any of them think. Her father pulled her into another rare hug. That's my girl. That's my fierce, brilliant girl. That night, Charlotte lay in bed replaying the afternoon. The stares, the whispers, Lady Margaret's barely concealed hostility. Alexander's steady presence beside her, his hand occasionally brushing hers, the way he'd looked at her like she was precious. Lady Agnes's immediate acceptance, the easy conversation, the feeling of being welcomed into his family. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. More stares, more whispers, more people questioning why Alexander had chosen her. But tomorrow she'd face them with Alexander beside her, and that made all the difference. The MacLeod dinner party was every bit as dreadful as Alexander had warned, and somehow worse. Charlotte arrived on Alexander's arm, wearing her finest evening dress, a deep burgundy silk that Moira had declared absolutely stunning, with delicate beading along the bodice that caught the light. Her mother had insisted on the Pemberton garnets, a necklace and earrings that had been in the family for 3 generations. She'd felt elegant walking down her own stairs. She felt underdressed the moment she entered the MacLeod drawing room. Every other lady present wore gowns that probably cost enough to feed a family for a year, dripping with jewels that caught the candlelight like stars captured and pinned to flesh. The room itself was overwhelmingly opulent. Gilt everywhere, crystal chandeliers, silk wall coverings, paintings in heavy gold frames, furniture so ornate it looked uncomfortable. Lady Margaret Fraser wore emeralds the size of quail eggs at her throat, with matching earrings that swung with each movement of her head. Her gown was pale green silk that must have required 30 yards of fabric, the train so long a maid had to carry it. Miss Eleanor Campbell was wrapped in 3 strands of pearls that must have taken 3 generations to accumulate. Her pink gown so elaborately ruched and gathered it looked like a confection from a French bakery. Even Lady Isabel MacLeod, the hostess, wore diamonds that made Charlotte's simple garnets look like costume jewelry from a market stall, a collar of stones so elaborate it looked like chainmail made of captured starlight. "Stop it," Alexander murmured in her ear as they were announced, his hand warm and solid at the small of her back. "Stop what?" "Comparing yourself," he said quietly, his breath warm against her ear. "You look beautiful. They look expensive. There's a difference." Lord and Lady MacLeod greeted them with careful politeness that didn't quite mask their curiosity. Charlotte could practically see Lady MacLeod cataloging every detail of her appearance. The modest garnets, the relatively simple gown, the lack of elaborate jewels, and filing it away for later dissection. "Your Grace, Lady Charlotte," Lady MacLeod said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "How delightful that you could join us. We've heard so much about your courtship." The pause before courtship was deliberate, weighted with skepticism. The dinner was arranged with typical aristocratic precision. Couples separated to encourage varied conversation, seating orchestrated with mathematical precision to balance rank and consequence. Every detail designed to facilitate appropriate social interaction while subtly enforcing hierarchy. Charlotte found herself seated between Lord Rothwell, the elderly gentleman who'd bowed to them in Prince's Street Gardens, and a younger man she didn't recognize. Alexander was across the table and 3 seats down, close enough that she could see him, could catch his eye, but too far for private conversation or protection. She watched him charm Lady MacLeod on his left, while simultaneously deflecting obvious flirtation from a young Lady Charlotte didn't recognize on his right. The girl couldn't have been more than 18, with blonde ringlets and a laugh like wind chimes that carried across the table at inappropriate moments. He caught Charlotte's eye twice and smiled in a way that said he'd rather be anywhere else. A small intimacy that warmed her despite the hostile atmosphere. Lady Charlotte, Lord Rothwell said, turning his attention to her as the first course was served, a clear consommé in delicate porcelain bowls. I must confess to considerable curiosity. How did you capture the Duke of Strathearn's notoriously elusive heart? It was delicately phrased, the question wrapped in apparent admiration, but essentially asked, what makes you special enough for a duke? What trick did you use? What spell did you cast? I wore a terrible dress and argued with him about philosophy, Charlotte said honestly, taking a sip of her soup. Apparently that was more interesting than agreeing with everything he said whilst wearing expensive clothing. Lord Rothwell laughed, a genuine, surprised sound that made several nearby diners turn to look. I like you, Lady Charlotte. You remind me of my late wife. She never bothered with polite lies either. Drove half of society mad, but she was the most interesting woman I ever met. Kept me on my toes for 40 years. I'm sorry for your loss, Charlotte said softly. Don't be. I had 40 glorious years with someone who made me think, made me laugh, made me a better man. That's more than most people get. He raised his wine glass slightly. I suspect the Duke is hoping for the same thing. He's had his fill of pretty ornaments. He wants a partner. The younger man on her other side, introduced as Mr. James Fraser, Margaret's older brother, was considerably less charming. He spent most of the first 2 courses making pointed comments about sudden elevations in circumstance and unexpected attachments, his voice just loud enough to carry to the nearby diners, but quiet enough to maintain plausible deniability. Such an interesting season this is turning out to be, he said as the fish course was served, poached salmon with some kind of cream sauce. One never knows what unexpected developments might occur. Why? Just last week, I would have wagered considerable sums that certain attachments were quite impossible. Indeed, Charlotte said neutrally, refusing to take the bait. Of course, society is generally accepting of unusual matches, he continued, his tone suggesting the opposite. Provided, of course, that both parties bring something of value to the arrangement. Title and bloodline on one side, fortune and connections on the other. When such balance exists, even the most unlikely pairing can achieve a sort of respectability. The implication was clear. Charlotte brought neither fortune nor impressive connections. Therefore, the match was not just unlikely but inappropriate, unbalanced, doomed to fail or cause scandal. Charlotte endured it with what she hoped was dignified silence, but her hands tightened on her silverware. Across the table, she saw Alexander's jaw tighten each time Mr. Fraser made a particularly cutting remark, but the formality of the dinner prevented him from intervening. Social rules dictated that conversations remain within designated seating arrangements, that the Duke couldn't simply lean across the table to defend her without causing a scene. After what felt like 17 years, through the fish course, the poultry course, the meat course, each accompanied by different wines that Charlotte barely tasted, the ladies withdrew to the drawing room, whilst the gentlemen remained with their port and cigars. This, Charlotte knew from painful experience, was when the real assessment would happen, the real battle. When men were present, women maintained certain standards of behavior. But in the drawing room, with only their own sex present, the clause came out. Lady MacLeod arranged herself on the most prominent sofa, a throne, really, upholstered in gold silk, and gestured for everyone to sit. The other ladies arranged themselves in a careful hierarchy, Lady Margaret and Lady Isabel flanking the hostess like generals at war, Eleanor Campbell and several other young ladies forming a second rank, older matrons arranging themselves as judges and jury. Charlotte chose a chair slightly apart from the main group, hoping to avoid direct confrontation, perhaps even to fade into the background. She'd become quite good at being invisible over the years. No such luck. Lady Charlotte, Lady Margaret said sweetly, her emerald earrings catching the lamplight, throwing green sparkles across her pale throat like a necklace of imprisoned fireflies. We're all simply dying to understand. What is it like courting the Duke? He's been so resistant to attachment these past years, so very particular in his requirements. The question sounded innocent, genuine curiosity from one lady to another. But the undertone was there for anyone listening. What trick did you use? What deception did you employ? What makes you think you belong here? The room fell silent. Every lady present turned to look at Charlotte, fans pausing mid-flutter, teacups suspended halfway to lips. Waiting, judging. His Grace has been kind enough to seek my company, Charlotte said carefully, keeping her voice level. I find him to be intelligent, thoughtful, and considerably more interesting than most gentlemen of my acquaintance. How diplomatic, Miss Eleanor Campbell murmured from her position beside Lady Isabel. Her pink gown matched the roses painted on the porcelain tea service, probably deliberately, though I suppose one must be diplomatic when one's position is precarious. Charlotte's hands tightened in her lap, crumpling the burgundy silk. I'm not certain I understand your meaning, Miss Campbell. Don't you? Eleanor's smile was poisonous, all sweetness on the surface with venom underneath. I'm simply saying that courtships are such uncertain things. They can end so quickly, especially when based on novelty rather than genuine compatibility. When founded on temporary fascination rather than shared background, shared values, shared everything that matters for a successful ducal marriage. Eleanor, Lady MacLeod said warningly, but her tone was perfunctory, lacking real censure. She wanted to see where this would go, Charlotte realized. They all did. This was entertainment for them. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She leaned forward, her pearls swinging, her expression carrying false concern. I'm simply saying that the Duke has always preferred ladies of exceptional beauty and accomplishment. I mean no offense, Lady Charlotte. I'm certain you have many fine qualities, virtues perhaps not immediately visible, but one does wonder how long such an unconventional choice will hold his interest. How long before he remembers what he could have had, what he should have had. The room fell silent. This was no longer subtle innuendo. This was a direct attack, witnessed by Edinburgh's social elite. Every lady present watched Charlotte, waiting to see how she'd respond. Charlotte could feel her cheeks burning. Part of her wanted to flee, to escape this drawing room of beautiful, accomplished women who clearly thought she didn't belong here, who were probably right to think so. Part of her wanted to defend herself, to list every conversation she'd had with Alexander, every moment where he'd looked at her like she mattered, to prove that this was real. But a larger part, the part that had worn her worst dress and refused to apologize for reading philosophy, the part that had corrected Lord Ashworth and faced the consequences, was simply angry. Furiously, righteously angry. Miss Campbell, Charlotte said quietly, but her voice carried in the silent room. Steady despite her racing heart, clear despite the fear trying to choke her. I appreciate your concern for the Duke's romantic welfare, though I can't help but notice that you seem remarkably invested in his choices for someone who, if memory serves, he's never courted himself. Eleanor's face flushed, 2 spots of color appearing high on her carefully powdered cheeks. Charlotte felt something unlock inside her, something she'd kept caged for 2 years. The Duke has explained his preferences to me quite clearly. He spent 2 years surrounded by ladies who perform for him rather than engage with him. Ladies who see him as a title to acquire rather than a person to know. Ladies who would rather agree with everything he says than risk genuine conversation, genuine disagreement, genuine anything. She paused, meeting Eleanor's gaze directly, refusing to look away. He told me about sitting through countless dinners where the lady beside him spoke only of watercolors and weather. About dances where his partners laughed at jokes that weren't funny and agreed with opinions they didn't understand. About feeling like an object to be won rather than a person to be known. Charlotte's voice grew stronger. So if that's what you consider exceptional accomplishment, the ability to perform, to flatter, to agree, to be decorative and pleasant and utterly devoid of genuine personality, then I'm quite glad to be lacking in it. Because the Duke doesn't want that. He's had that offered to him dozens of times by women far more beautiful and accomplished than I could ever hope to be. And he's chosen differently. She stood, unable to remain seated for this. What he wants, what he's told me he's been searching for, is authenticity, honesty. Someone who treats him like a person rather than a prize. Someone who challenges him rather than flatters him. Someone real. Charlotte looked around the room, meeting the eyes of each lady present. So yes, Miss Campbell, I am unconventional. I read philosophy and argue about politics. I have opinions about subjects ladies aren't supposed to understand. I refuse to pretend to be less than I am to make men comfortable. And the Duke finds that attractive. Not despite these qualities, but because of them. If that's something you cannot understand, Charlotte said directly to Eleanor, then perhaps that's why he never courted you. The silence that followed was absolute. Someone's teacup rattled in its saucer. A log shifted in the fireplace with a sound like a gunshot. Lady Margaret made a small sound that might have been admiration or shock. Lady MacLeod's expression was carefully neutral, but Charlotte thought she saw the ghost of a smile. Eleanor stood abruptly, her face now completely red, her carefully arranged curls trembling with barely suppressed fury. "I think I shall take some air. This conversation has become quite tiresome. Unseemly, really." She swept from the room with as much dignity as she could muster, which wasn't much. Her exit would have been more impressive if she hadn't stumbled slightly on her elaborate train, catching herself on a side table and nearly knocking over a vase. After she left, the remaining ladies stared at Charlotte with varying expressions: respect, wariness, calculation. Some looked impressed. Others looked like they were reassessing their understanding of the world. A few looked like they were already planning how to align themselves with the future Duchess of Strathearn. "Well," Lady Margaret said finally, her voice carefully controlled, "that was extraordinarily interesting." The gentlemen rejoined them shortly after, and Alexander immediately gravitated to Charlotte's side. He took one look at her face, flushed, eyes bright, posture rigid with leftover adrenaline, and frowned. "What happened?" he murmured, his hand finding hers and squeezing gently. "Miss Campbell happened," Charlotte said quietly, her voice shaking slightly now that the confrontation was over. "I may have been somewhat sharp with her." "Good," Alexander said with satisfaction, his eyes scanning the room and no doubt noting Eleanor's absence. "She's been making pointed comments about my surprising choice all evening. I heard her whispering to Fraser during the port. They were planning something for when the ladies withdrew. I should have warned you." "I held my own," Charlotte said, then paused. "I think either I brilliantly defended our courtship, or I just ensured that every drawing room in Edinburgh will declare me completely unsuitable by tomorrow afternoon." "My money's on brilliant defense," Alexander said, loud enough that several nearby ladies could hear. "If Eleanor retreated, you won. She doesn't withdraw from conflicts she thinks she can win." They managed to escape the party relatively early, Alexander citing a prior engagement that Charlotte suspected was entirely fictional. In his carriage, driving through Edinburgh's lamplit streets, the sound of horses' hooves on cobblestones mixing with the distant sounds of nighttime city life, Charlotte finally allowed herself to relax. "That was dreadful," she admitted, sinking back against the leather seat. The tension drained out of her all at once, leaving her exhausted. "That was society," Alexander corrected, his arm coming around her shoulders, pulling her against his side in a way that was probably inappropriate but felt necessary. "Filled with people who are jealous or bored or simply cruel for entertainment. People who build themselves up by tearing others down." He glanced at her, his expression serious in the lamplight flickering through the carriage windows. "But you held your own beautifully. Lord Rothwell told me you were magnificently honest, which from him is high praise indeed. He said you remind him of his wife, and he adored her more than life itself. Miss Campbell thinks I'm not good enough for you." "Miss Campbell," Alexander said bluntly, "spent an entire season trying to capture my attention and failed spectacularly. She played piano for me, 3 separate performances, each more elaborate than the last. She showed me her watercolors, portfolios of them, hours of my life I'll never recover. She laughed at everything I said, whether it was funny or not. And through all of it, I felt nothing. Nothing but polite boredom and a desperate wish to be elsewhere." He turned to face her more fully, the carriage swaying slightly as they turned a corner. "Her opinion is remarkably unimportant to me, Charlotte. What matters is what we think, what we feel, what we build together." He pulled the carriage to a stop outside her parents' home, but didn't immediately help her down. Instead, he turned to face her, his expression serious in the lamplight, shadows playing across his strong features. "Charlotte, I need you to understand something. The next few weeks are going to be difficult, possibly the most difficult weeks of your life. People will say cruel things, not just Eleanor, but others. They'll question why I chose you. They'll try to undermine your confidence and make you doubt yourself, doubt us, doubt everything." "I know," Charlotte said quietly, fear creeping in now that the adrenaline was fading. "But I need you to hold on to this truth," Alexander continued, his hand coming up to cup her cheek, his thumb brushing across her cheekbone with infinite gentleness. "I am courting you because you are exactly what I've been searching for. Not despite your honesty, but because of it. Not despite your intelligence, but because of it. Not despite your refusal to perform and pretend, but because of it. His dark blue eyes held hers with fierce intensity. You are not a novelty that will wear off. You are not a mistake I'll regret. You are not a temporary fascination or a rebellion against society's expectations. You are the woman I've been half in love with for 2 years, and I'm finally, brave enough to pursue what I actually want instead of what everyone tells me I should want. Tears pricked at Charlotte's eyes. What if they're right? What if 6 months from now you realize that I can't do this, that I'm not suited to be a duchess, that the beautiful, accomplished ladies were the right choice after all? Charlotte. Alexander's voice was firm, brooking no argument. He leaned closer, his forehead almost touching hers, his breath warm on her face. In 6 months, I intend to marry you. In a year, I intend to wake up beside you every morning and discuss philosophy over breakfast while you correct my misquotations and argue with my interpretations. In 5 years, I intend to watch you terrify our children with your intelligence, whilst I look on in proud admiration, knowing that they'll grow up with a mother who teaches them that authenticity matters more than appearance. He paused, his voice dropping to something raw and vulnerable. In 50 years, if we're blessed with that much time, I intend to be sitting beside you in our library at Strathearn Castle, still arguing about Scottish history, still making each other laugh, still choosing each other every single day. The words hung between them, a promise and a vision and a future that felt impossibly real and impossibly distant all at once. That's a very specific timeline, Charlotte managed, trying for levity though her voice shook. I'm a planner, Alexander said. I like to be thorough. Charlotte laughed despite the tears streaming down her face now. This is mad. This is completely, absolutely mad. The best things usually are, Alexander said softly. Say you'll hold on, Charlotte. Say you won't let them drive you away, won't let their cruelty make you doubt what we have. Say you'll trust that I know my own mind and my own heart. Charlotte looked at him. This Duke who could have chosen any woman in Scotland, who could have had beauty and accomplishment and perfect propriety, but who had instead chosen her. Honest, argumentative, unconventional her. I'll hold on, she whispered. I promise. Good, Alexander said, and then he kissed her. It was brief, chaste, appropriate for an engaged couple even though they weren't quite engaged yet, just the press of his lips against hers, warm and gentle and full of promise. But Charlotte felt it everywhere, felt it like a brand, like a claim, like coming home. When he pulled back, both of them were breathing hard. I should, Alexander started. You should, Charlotte agreed, though neither of them moved. Finally, propriety won. Alexander helped her down from the carriage, walked her to the door like the gentleman he was, bowed over her hand like they were in a ballroom rather than standing on her doorstep at nearly midnight. Tomorrow, he said. Tomorrow, Charlotte agreed, though she didn't know what tomorrow would bring. More stares, more whispers, more people questioning their match. But tomorrow she'd face it with the memory of Alexander's kiss, his promises, his vision of their future together. Tomorrow could bring whatever it wanted. Tonight, she had hope. Charlotte floated into the house on legs that felt unsteady, her lips still tingling from Alexander's kiss, her mind spinning with everything he'd said. In 6 months, in a year, in 5 years, in 50 years, he'd planned their whole life together. Not just the courtship, not just the wedding, but decades of mornings and arguments and children and growing old together. Her parents were waiting in the entrance hall again, her mother pretending to arrange flowers that were already perfect, her father pretending to read a book he was holding upside down. How was it? Her mother asked the moment the door closed. Horrible and wonderful, Charlotte said honestly. Eleanor Campbell attacked me in the drawing room. I defended myself perhaps too vigorously. Alexander kissed me on the doorstep. He what? Her mother's voice climbed an octave. It was very proper, Charlotte assured her, though her cheeks burned at the memory. Entirely appropriate for a courting couple. You're not engaged, her mother pointed out. Not yet, Charlotte said, the words surprising her even as she said them. Her father closed his book, The Wealth of Nations, which he'd definitely been holding upside down. Charlotte, come into my study for a moment. She followed, still floating, still feeling like she might wake up at any moment to discover this had all been an elaborate dream. Her father closed the door and leaned against his desk, studying her with that expression that meant he was about to say something important. "Alexander Sinclair is in love with you," he said without preamble. Charlotte's heart stuttered. "He what?" "He's in love with you," her father repeated. "I saw it in his eyes when he asked permission to court you. I saw it in the way he looked at you during that first tea. And if he kissed you tonight, after the week you've had, after watching you handle society's cruelty," he shook his head. "That man is going to propose, Charlotte. Soon. Probably sooner than is conventional or wise," he said. Charlotte's voice trailed off. How did she explain what Alexander had said? The timeline he'd laid out, the future he'd envisioned, the 50 years he'd promised? "What did he say?" her father prompted gently. "He said that in 6 months he intends to marry me," Charlotte admitted. "That in a year he intends to wake up beside me every morning. That in 5 years he wants to watch me," her voice broke. "To watch me teach our children that authenticity matters more than appearance." Her father's expression softened in a way she'd rarely seen. "And what do you want, Charlotte? Not what society wants, not what your mother wants, not even what Alexander wants. What do you want?" Charlotte thought about it, really thought about it. About Alexander's laugh when she argued with him. About the way he looked at her, like she was fascinating rather than troublesome. About Lady Agnes welcoming her into their home. About the future he'd described, full of mornings and arguments and children and growing old together. About feeling seen, truly seen, for the first time in her life. "I want him," she whispered. "I want all of it. The marriage, the life together, the arguing over breakfast, the growing old. I want to wake up every morning and know that someone chose me, not despite who I am, but because of who I am." "Then hold on," her father said. "The next few weeks will test you both. Society won't accept this easily. There will be more dinner parties like tonight, more confrontations, more people trying to drive a wedge between you. Can you endure that?" Charlotte thought about Eleanor's attack, about Margaret's subtle hostility, about the stairs in Prince's Street Gardens, about the weeks and months ahead, about every social event where she'd be measured and found wanting by people who didn't matter but whose opinions would be everywhere. "With Alexander beside me," she said. "Yes, I can endure anything." Her father pulled her into a hug. "That's my girl. That's my fierce, brave girl." That night, Charlotte lay in bed unable to sleep, her mind racing. In 6 months, in a year, in 5 years. Alexander had painted a picture of their future, and Charlotte wanted it with a fierceness that frightened her. But first they had to survive society's judgment, survive the next few weeks of scrutiny and speculation and subtle sabotage. She could do it. They could do it. Together. The next 3 days passed in a blur of social obligations. Alexander escorted her to a musicale at the Assembly Rooms, where Charlotte endured whispers and stares with her chin held high. They attended a poetry reading at Lady Carmichael's townhouse, where the older woman surprised everyone by warmly welcoming Charlotte and giving a pointed lecture about intellectual women being the backbone of civilization. Each evening, Alexander walked her to her Continue. Door. Each evening, the good night grew longer, his hands lingering on hers, his eyes searching her face as if memorizing every detail. On the 4th evening, after a particularly tedious dinner at Lord Hamilton's where Charlotte had been seated between 2 men who'd spent the entire meal discussing hunting, Alexander didn't immediately help her down from the carriage. "Charlotte," he said, his voice carrying an odd tension. "There's something I need to tell you." Her heart sank. This was it. He'd realized his mistake. The novelty had worn off. He'd come to his senses, and, "I'm terrible at this," he continued, running a hand through his hair and making it stand up in ways that should have looked ridiculous but somehow made him more endearing. "I had a whole speech planned. Very eloquent. Lots of poetic metaphors. Aunt Agnes helped me write it." "Alexander, let me finish," he said. "Please. Because if I don't say this now, I'm going to lose my nerve, and that would be tragic because I've been carrying this around for 3 days, and it's been burning a hole in my pocket." He reached into his coat and withdrew a small velvet box. Charlotte's breath stopped entirely. "I know this is irregular," Alexander said, his words tumbling out fast now, nervous in a way she'd never seen him. "Spectacularly irregular. We've been courting for less than a week. Your father will probably challenge me to a duel. Society will lose its collective mind. Every rule of propriety says I should wait months." should court you properly through a full season, should give you time to be certain. He opened the box. Inside was a ring, a sapphire surrounded by small diamonds that caught the lamplight and threw blue fire across the carriage interior. But I've already waited 2 years, Alexander continued, his dark blue eyes intense on hers. 2 years of watching you from across ballrooms. 2 years of convincing myself I should choose duty over happiness. 2 years of being a coward. He took a shaky breath. And then you walked into your father's study in that terrible gray dress, looking at me like I was just Alexander rather than the Duke. And everything I'd been telling myself for 2 years just dissolved. Like morning mist when the sun rises. Charlotte Pemberton, he said formally, though his voice shook. I know we've only been officially courting for 6 days. I know society will say this is too fast, too impulsive, too unconventional. I know I should wait, should be patient, should follow the rules. He took her hand, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. But I don't want to wait. I don't want to be patient. And I've spent my entire life following rules that made me miserable. His voice grew stronger, more certain. In 6 months, I want to marry you. I want to wake up beside you every morning and hear your opinions about everything from philosophy to politics to the appropriate way to cook eggs. In a year, I want to take you to Strathearn Castle and show you the Highland sunsets and argue with you about Scottish history while we walk through heather that's older than either of our families. In 5 years, he continued, his voice thick with emotion, I want to watch you be brilliant and argumentative and completely yourself, teaching our children that intelligence is a gift and authenticity is a virtue, and that they should never diminish themselves to make others comfortable. He paused, his eyes searching hers. In 50 years, if we're blessed with that much time, I want to be sitting in our library, still choosing you, still amazed that you chose me back, still grateful for that terrible gray dress that brought us together. So I'm asking now, Charlotte, even though it's too soon and too impulsive and completely inappropriate, because I've wasted enough time, and I don't want to waste another moment hiding what I want. And what I want, what I've wanted since that first conversation 2 years ago, is you. He took a breath. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my Duchess? Of spending your life with me, arguing with me, challenging me, keeping me honest and real and human? Would you marry me? The world narrowed to Alexander's face, the ring sparkling in the box, the impossible question hanging between them. Charlotte could hear her own heartbeat, could hear the distant sounds of Edinburgh at night. Carriages on cobblestones, voices from a nearby tavern, the wind through trees. This is mad, she whispered, tears streaming down her face. Completely, utterly mad. Completely, Alexander agreed. But he was smiling now, hopeful and terrified and utterly vulnerable. But I've discovered I quite enjoy madness, particularly when it involves you. Charlotte looked at the ring, the sapphire the exact color of his eyes, the diamonds catching light and throwing rainbows. She thought about the gray dress, about Prince's street gardens, about Lady Agnes's drawing room, about Eleanor's attack and her own fierce defense, about Alexander's steady presence through all of it, his unwavering certainty that she was enough exactly as she was. Yes, she said, her voice breaking. Yes, Alexander, I'll marry you. I'll argue with you about philosophy over breakfast and teach our children that authenticity matters and spend 50 years choosing you over and over again. Yes. His smile transformed his face. His hands shook as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her, as if this had always been inevitable. It was my grandmother's, he said softly, looking at the ring on her hand. She was apparently quite scandalous in her day, ran away to marry my grandfather against her father's wishes, spent her life doing exactly what she wanted rather than what society expected. Aunt Agnes says I remind her of her grandmother, that we both fell in love with unconventional women who made us better. Then he was kissing her, deeper than before, less chaste, his hands cradling her face like she was something precious and fragile and infinitely valuable. Charlotte kissed him back, pouring 2 years of longing into it, 2 years of watching from afar, 2 years of believing this could never happen. When they finally pulled apart, both breathing hard, Alexander rested his forehead against hers. We need to tell your parents, he said. They're probably watching from the window, Charlotte pointed out. Almost certainly, Alexander agreed. Your father definitely has a pistol somewhere nearby, just in case I wasn't being honorable. They climbed down from the carriage, and Alexander kept hold of her hand, the one with the ring, as if he couldn't quite bear to let her go yet. They walked to the door together, and before Alexander could knock, it opened. Charlotte's parents stood in the entrance hall, her mother's hands clasped over her mouth, her father's expression somewhere between exasperation and resigned amusement. He proposed, Charlotte said unnecessarily, holding up her hand so the sapphire caught the hallway lamplight. I can see that, her father said dryly. Your Grace, might I ask if you plan to request my permission before or after the proposal? Alexander started, then stopped. After apparently. I'm very sorry, Lord Pemberton. I should have followed proper protocol. I intended to. But then Charlotte was in the carriage, and the ring was burning a hole in my pocket, and I lost all sense of propriety in. And you proposed to my daughter after 6 days of courtship, her father finished. Yes, sir. Alexander straightened his shoulders, meeting her father's gaze directly. I realize it's unconventional. Unconventional, her father repeated. That's certainly one word for it. Papa, Charlotte interjected, but her father held up a hand. However, he continued, his expression softening, I've watched you with my daughter this past week. I've seen how you look at her, how you defend her, how you value her mind and her honesty. I've seen her happier than she's been in years, more confident, more herself. He paused. So yes, Your Grace, you have my blessing. Retroactively, since you apparently don't understand how these things are supposed to work. Thank you, Lord Pemberton, Alexander said, relief evident in his voice. I promise I'll take care of her, that You'll argue with her about philosophy over breakfast and teach your children that authenticity matters, her father said, and Alexander's eyes widened. Walls are thin, Your Grace, and my study window was open. Charlotte felt her cheeks burn. Papa. But her father was smiling now. Welcome to the family, Alexander. God help you, because you're going to need it. Her mother finally found her voice. I need to write to everyone. Immediately. The wedding. Oh heavens, the wedding. How long should we wait? 3 months? 6 months? We need to order your dress from London, and the flowers, and the invitations. 3 months, Alexander said firmly. I've waited 2 years. I'm not waiting longer than 3 months. 3 months. Charlotte's mother looked faint. That's barely enough time to. Then we'll keep it simple, Alexander said, his hand tightening on Charlotte's. Something elegant but intimate. I don't need a spectacle. I just need Charlotte. Her mother looked like she wanted to argue, but saw something in Alexander's expression that made her nod instead. 3 months, then. I'll make it work. Her father caught Charlotte's eye and gestured toward his study. A word, my dear. Charlotte followed, the ring heavy and perfect on her finger. Are you certain? Her father asked once the door was closed. Not about loving him. I can see that clearly enough. But about the life this brings? The scrutiny, the responsibilities, the constant performance required of a duchess. Charlotte thought about Lady Agnes's words. Everything else can be learned. But genuine partnership, real companionship, authentic love, that can't be taught. I'm certain, she said. It won't be easy. Society won't accept this quietly. There will be more confrontations, more people questioning whether I'm suitable, more pressure to conform to expectations I don't meet. But Papa, he chose me knowing all of that. He chose me not despite my flaws but seeing them clearly and loving me anyway. She looked at the ring, at the sapphire that matched Alexander's eyes. I'd rather face a difficult life with Alexander than an easy life without him. I'd rather be challenged and supported and truly known than comfortable and lonely and performing for strangers. Her father pulled her into another hug. Then I'm happy for you, darling girl. Terrified, but happy. That's the family motto, apparently, Charlotte said against his shoulder. Terrified but happy. When she emerged from her father's study, Alexander was being interrogated by her mother about his family history, his properties, his expectations for the wedding, whether he preferred roses or lilies, if he thought Lord and Lady MacLeod should be invited given recent events. He looked both overwhelmed and delighted, answering questions with patience while his eyes kept straying to Charlotte, to the ring on her finger, as if needing constant confirmation that this was real. Finally, propriety demanded he leave. At the door, he held her hand one final time. Tomorrow, he said, we announce it at the Hamilton Ball. I want everyone who doubted us to understand that this is real and permanent and completely non-negotiable. They'll lose their minds, Charlotte warned. Let them, Alexander said cheerfully. I've stopped caring what they think. I only care what you think. I think, Charlotte said softly, that I'm the luckiest woman in Scotland. I'm the lucky one, Alexander corrected. I'm marrying the woman I love. The woman who saw past my title and loved me anyway. The woman brave enough to wear a terrible dress and argue about philosophy and be completely, authentically herself. He kissed her hand, his lips lingering on her knuckles. I love you, Charlotte Pemberton. I should have said it first, before the proposal, but I'm saying it now. I love you. Your brilliant mind and your sharp tongue and your absolute refusal to be anything but yourself. I love you too, Charlotte whispered. I've loved you since that first conversation 2 years ago, when you treated me like a person rather than a decorative object. Best 15 minutes of my life, Alexander said, followed by 2 years of cowardice, and now a lifetime of making up for it. After he left, Charlotte stood in the entrance hall, staring at the ring on her finger, feeling the weight of it, literal and metaphorical. In 3 months, she'd be the Duchess of Strathearn. In 3 months, her life would change completely. But tonight, she'd allow herself pure joy. That night, Charlotte couldn't sleep. Her mind kept spinning through everything. The proposal, the ring, the announcement tomorrow at the Hamilton ball. All of society would know. There would be no going back, no changing her mind, no escape from the scrutiny and speculation. Part of her was terrified. The part that remembered Eleanor's attack, Margaret's hostility, the whispers in Prince's Street gardens. But a larger part was simply happy. Deliriously, impossibly happy. She was going to marry Alexander Sinclair. The man who'd seen her in her worst dress and loved her anyway. The man who valued her mind and her honesty and her complete inability to be anyone but herself. 3 months until the wedding. A lifetime after that. Charlotte finally fell asleep with the sapphire ring on her finger, dreaming of Highland sunsets and arguments over breakfast and 50 years of choosing each other over and over again. The morning of the Hamilton ball, Charlotte woke with equal parts excitement and dread. Today, everyone would know. Today, there would be no more speculation, no more wondering if Alexander would come to his senses. Today, they'd stand before Edinburgh society and announce their engagement. Moira spent hours on Charlotte's appearance, choosing a gown of deep blue silk that brought out her eyes and, not coincidentally, matched the sapphire on her finger. Her hair was arranged in an elaborate style that managed to look elegant rather than overly fussy. The Pemberton garnets were replaced with sapphires that Alexander had sent over that morning. Not as elaborate as the jewels the other ladies would wear, but beautiful in their simplicity. When she finally descended the stairs, her father was waiting in the entrance hall. You look like a duchess, he said quietly. I feel like I'm going to be sick, Charlotte admitted. That's normal. Your mother felt the same way before our engagement was announced. She threw up in a potted plant at the Carmichael ball. That's not helping, Papa. He smiled. You'll be fine. You have Alexander beside you, and you've already survived Eleanor Campbell's attack. Everything after that is easy by comparison. Alexander arrived precisely on time, looking devastatingly handsome in formal black evening wear. When he saw Charlotte, he stopped in the doorway, just staring. You're beautiful, he said finally. You're biased, Charlotte replied, but she was smiling. Completely, Alexander agreed, offering his arm. Ready to shock Edinburgh society? Absolutely not. Perfect. Neither am I. The Hamilton ball was already in full swing when they arrived. The ballroom was decorated in gold and white, candles everywhere, the air thick with the scent of hothouse flowers and expensive perfumes. The crowd was substantial. It seemed like every member of Edinburgh society had turned out tonight. They had to know something was coming, Charlotte realized. News traveled fast in their circles. Whispers of the Duke's courtship, of an unconventional match, of a possible announcement had probably been circulating for days. The moment they were announced, His Grace the Duke of Strathearn and Lady Charlotte Pemberton, the ballroom fell silent. Conversations died mid-sentence. Fans paused mid-flutter. Even the orchestra missed a beat. Charlotte's hand tightened on Alexander's arm. He covered her hand with his, warm and solid and reassuring. Steady, he murmured. We're doing this together. They descended the stairs into the ballroom. Lord and Lady Hamilton greeted them with barely concealed curiosity, their eyes immediately drawn to the sapphire on Charlotte's finger, impossible to miss, catching the candlelight and throwing blue fire. "Your Grace, Lady Charlotte," Lady Hamilton said, her voice carefully neutral. "How delightful to see you both." Alexander didn't waste time with pleasantries. "Actually, Lady Hamilton, we're delighted to share some happy news this evening. If I might have everyone's attention." Lady Hamilton's eyes widened. She gestured to the orchestra, which fell silent. The ballroom, already quiet, became absolutely still. Alexander turned to face the assembled guests, his hand still covering Charlotte's where it rested on his arm. She could feel every eye in the room on them, could practically hear the collective held breath. "Ladies and gentlemen," Alexander said, his voice clear and carrying in the silent ballroom, "I wanted to share with all of you that Lady Charlotte Pemberton has done me the extraordinary honor of accepting my proposal of marriage." The silence lasted approximately 3 seconds before the ballroom erupted. Some reactions were positive, genuine applause, delighted exclamations from older matrons who appreciated a good love story. Lady Agnes pushed through the crowd to embrace Charlotte, tears streaming down her face, not caring that her display of emotion was slightly improper. Lord Rothwell raised his glass in a toast from across the room, nodding with approval. Charlotte's own parents stood near the entrance, her mother crying, her father smiling with pride. But other reactions were less kind. Charlotte saw Lady Margaret's face go pale, then flush an angry red. For just a moment, her carefully constructed mask slipped entirely, revealing devastation so raw that Charlotte felt a pang of genuine guilt. Margaret had loved him, in her own way. She'd expected him to choose her, beautiful, accomplished, perfectly appropriate Margaret. And instead, he'd chosen the Earl's blue-stocking daughter. Then Margaret's mask returned. She turned to whisper furiously to her brother, both of them staring at Charlotte with expressions that promised this wasn't over. Miss Eleanor Campbell looked like she'd been slapped. Her face had gone completely white, her hands clenched so tightly on her fan that Charlotte heard the sticks crack. Her mother was beside her, whispering urgently, probably trying to prevent a scene. Lady Isabel MacLeod stood frozen in the center of the ballroom, her diamonds glittering like armor, her expression one of complete disbelief. She'd been so certain Alexander would choose her, the diamond of the season, the perfect duchess. How could he choose Charlotte instead? Mr. James Fraser looked positively murderous, already moving through the crowd, probably to spread whatever poison he and Margaret had been planning. But Alexander seemed oblivious to the negative reactions. He was looking at Charlotte like she was the only person in the room, like the hundreds of staring faces didn't exist. "May I have this dance?" he asked formally, though his eyes were warm with love. "You may," Charlotte said, her voice steadier than she felt. The orchestra began a waltz, and Alexander led her onto the dance floor. For several measures, they danced alone, a deliberate statement, a public claiming that made Charlotte's cheeks burn but also filled her with fierce pride. Then other couples gradually joined them, and Charlotte found herself surrounded by a sea of faces, some genuinely happy for them, others clearly disapproving, most simply curious about this unexpected match. "Are you all right?" Alexander asked, spinning her through a turn. "Terrified and happy," Charlotte admitted. "Apparently that's becoming my default state." "Mine too," Alexander said. "I've been terrified since I proposed. Terrified you'd realize what you were getting into and change your mind." "Never," Charlotte said firmly. "You're stuck with me now." "Excellent," Alexander said, pulling her slightly closer than was probably proper. "That was always the plan." They danced 3 waltzes in succession, a scandalous number that would fuel gossip for weeks, but also sent a clear message. Alexander didn't care about propriety when it came to Charlotte. She was his fiancée, soon to be his wife, and he intended to spend as much time with her as possible regardless of what society thought. After the 3rd dance, they were immediately surrounded. Some people were genuine well-wishers, Lord Rothwell and his wife, several of her father's political allies. Lady Charlotte had never expected to approve. "Congratulations, Lady Charlotte," Mrs. Carmichael said, the fearsome dowager who'd given that lecture about intellectual women. "The Duke has chosen well. Intelligence and authenticity will serve you far better in a marriage than mere beauty." But others were less kind. Charlotte overheard fragments of conversation. "Can't believe he chose her over Margaret. What does he see in her? Clever enough, I suppose, but hardly Duchess material. Give it 6 months before he regrets it. Alexander heard them too. Charlotte felt him stiffen beside her, saw his jaw clench. But before he could respond, Lady Agnes appeared at his elbow. "Dance with your aunt," she ordered. Let Charlotte catch her breath. She's been on display long enough for one evening. Alexander looked torn, but Charlotte nodded. "Go. I'll be fine." He kissed her hand before allowing Lady Agnes to lead him away, a gesture so tender and public that it caused another wave of whispers. Charlotte found herself alone for the first time that evening, standing near the refreshment table, trying to catch her breath. The sapphire ring felt heavy on her finger, a constant reminder that this was real, that there was no going back. "Congratulations, Lady Charlotte." Charlotte turned to find Lady Isabel MacLeod standing beside her, beautiful in diamonds and ice blue silk. Up close, Charlotte could see the careful control in her expression, the way she held herself rigidly, as if one wrong move might shatter her composure. "Thank you, Lady Isabel," Charlotte said carefully, unsure what to expect. "I won't pretend I'm not surprised," Isabel said, her voice carefully neutral. "Or disappointed. I had rather expected the Duke to choose differently." "I'm sorry," Charlotte said, meaning it. She hadn't intended to hurt anyone. She'd just wanted Alexander, and he'd wanted her back. "Don't apologize," Isabel said sharply. "It's demeaning. You won. Accept it with grace." She paused, and something shifted in her expression, the mask cracking slightly. "He looks at you the way my father looked at my mother. Like you're the center of his universe. Like nothing else matters. I spent a year trying to earn that look, and he gave it to you after one conversation about philosophy." "Lady Isabel, I hope you'll be happy," Isabel interrupted, and Charlotte heard genuine pain beneath the formal words. "I hope he gives you 50 years of mournings and arguments and choosing each other. I hope you get everything you want." Then she walked away, leaving Charlotte staring after her, feeling the weight of what her happiness had cost others. But there was no time to dwell on it. Alexander returned, claimed her hand, led her into another dance. The evening continued. More congratulations, more barely concealed hostility, more whispers and stares and speculation. Through it all, Alexander remained steadfast at her side. When someone made a cutting remark, he responded with polite firmness. When Charlotte looked overwhelmed, he found excuses to escape to quieter corners. When her smile became strained, he whispered jokes that made her laugh despite herself. By the end of the evening, Charlotte's feet ached, her face hurt from smiling, and she'd had more champagne than was probably wise. But she'd survived. They'd survived. As Alexander escorted her home, she leaned against him in the carriage, exhausted but content. "That was," she started. "Awful and wonderful," Alexander finished. "Society knows now. Tomorrow, it will be in every newspaper, every gossip column, every conversation. There's no going back." "I don't want to go back," Charlotte said firmly. "Good," Alexander said, pulling her closer. "Because I'm not letting you go. You're mine now, Charlotte. For the next 3 months, and every day after that." When they reached her door, he kissed her goodnight. A proper kiss, deep and claiming, full of promises for their future. 3 months, he said against her lips. 3 months, Charlotte agreed. "I love you. I love you too." That night, Charlotte fell asleep with the sapphire ring on her finger, knowing that tomorrow would bring fresh challenges. But tonight, she'd been publicly claimed by the man she loved, in front of all of society. And somehow, impossibly, that was enough. The next 3 months passed in a whirlwind that Charlotte could barely keep track of. News of their engagement spread through Edinburgh like wildfire, then to London, then across the country. The newspapers were relentless, some praising Alexander's unconventional choice, others questioning whether Lady Charlotte Pemberton was truly suitable to be a duchess. The gossip columns were particularly vicious. The Duke of Strathearn's surprising choice of bride has set tongues wagging across Edinburgh. While Lady Charlotte is undoubtedly educated, one wonders if intellect alone is sufficient qualification for the demanding role of duchess. Sources close to the Duke suggest that His Grace's unconventional choice may reflect a temporary rebellion against society's expectations rather than a sound basis for matrimony. Lady Charlotte Pemberton, previously declared unmarriageable after the unfortunate Ashworth incident, has apparently found forgiveness in the arms of Scotland's most eligible bachelor. One can only hope the Duke will not come to regret his impulsive decision. Charlotte tried to ignore them, but the words stung. Each article felt like a fresh wound, another voice saying she wasn't enough, wasn't suitable, wasn't worthy of Alexander. But Alexander was furious. He wrote a letter to the Scotsman that was published prominently. To the editor, I write in response to recent speculation regarding my engagement to Lady Charlotte Pemberton. Let me be explicitly clear. My choice is neither surprising nor impulsive. Lady Charlotte is the most intelligent, honest, and remarkable woman I have ever met. Her education and intellectual abilities are not drawbacks to be overlooked, but virtues to be celebrated. I consider myself extraordinarily fortunate that she agreed to marry me, and I look forward to spending my life with a partner who challenges me to be better. Those who question her suitability reveal far more about their own limitations than hers. A. Sinclair, Duke of Strathearn. The letter caused another wave of gossip, but it also shifted the conversation. Suddenly, it was unfashionable to openly criticize Charlotte. Alexander's fierce defense made it clear that anyone who attacked her would answer to him. Lady Agnes proved to be an invaluable ally. She took Charlotte under her wing, teaching her about estate management, introducing her to Alexander's key staff, preparing her for the responsibilities she'd inherit as Duchess. But more than that, she became a friend, someone who understood what it meant to exist in society's highest circles whilst maintaining one's own identity. They'll never fully accept you, Agnes said frankly one afternoon over tea in her drawing room. Not completely. You'll always be the bluestocking who captured the Duke through wit rather than beauty. But who cares? The people who matter, the tenants, the staff, your family, Alexander, they accept you. The rest is just noise. The wedding planning was both exciting and exhausting. Charlotte's mother had wanted a grand affair at St. Giles Cathedral with hundreds of guests, elaborate decorations, a wedding breakfast that would be remembered for years. But Charlotte and Alexander insisted on something smaller, more intimate, more them. They compromised on a ceremony at St. Giles with about 200 guests, mostly family and close friends, with a few political allies of Charlotte's father and some of Alexander's ducal connections who couldn't be excluded without causing offense. Charlotte chose a dress of ivory silk with simple elegance, refusing the elaborate confection her mother had suggested. She would be comfortable, authentic, herself, even on her wedding day. The invitations went out. Some people accepted with genuine happiness. Others accepted because refusing would be a social disaster. A few, including Lady Margaret Fraser and Miss Eleanor Campbell, sent polite regrets, claiming prior commitments that everyone knew were fabrications. Charlotte felt relief more than disappointment. She didn't need everyone's approval. She only needed Alexander's. As the wedding date approached, Charlotte found herself plagued by fears she hadn't expected. Late at night, alone in her room, she'd wonder, what if she failed at being a duchess? What if she embarrassed Alexander at some crucial political dinner? What if duchesses needed skills she'd never learned? One evening, 2 weeks before the wedding, she stood at her window staring at the ring, her chest tight with panic. What if loving him wasn't enough? She must have made some sound, because her father appeared in her doorway. "Charlotte, what's wrong?" "I don't know how to be a duchess," she whispered. "Papa, what if I can't do this? What if I fail him?" Her father came to stand beside her. "Do you know what makes a good duchess? Estate management, political maneuvering, perfect social grace, all the things I don't possess." "No," her father said firmly. "Those things can be learned. What makes a good duchess is being a true partner to the Duke, supporting him, challenging him when needed, bringing something real and honest to a life that's often full of performance and pretense." He turned her to face him. "You already do that, Charlotte. You've been doing it since the day you met him. Everything else is just details." The wedding day itself was a blur of nerves and joy and overwhelming emotion. Charlotte woke before dawn, unable to sleep. She watched the sun rise over Edinburgh, painting the city in shades of gold and rose, and thought, "This is the last sunrise I'll see as Charlotte Pemberton. The next one, I'll be the Duchess of Strathearn." Moira helped her dress, the ivory silk feeling cool and substantial against her skin. Her hair was arranged in a style that was elegant but not overly elaborate, pinned back to show her face, with a few curls left loose to soften the effect. The sapphire engagement ring stayed on her finger. She'd refused to remove it even for the ceremony. Her mother cried through the entire preparation. Her father stood in the doorway, looking at her with an expression that was equal parts pride and heartbreak. "You're beautiful," he said finally, "and brave, and I'm so proud to be your father." "Don't make me cry," Charlotte warned. "Moira spent an hour on my face." "Too late," her mother said, already crying. "We're all crying. It's a wedding. Crying is required." The carriage ride to St. Giles was short but felt eternal. Charlotte's hands trembled in her lap. Her father held one of them, steady and warm. "Last chance to run," he joked, but his eyes were serious. "If you have any doubts." "No doubts," Charlotte said firmly. "I want this. I want him. Then let's go get you married." St. Giles Cathedral was beautiful. Ancient stone and soaring arches, light streaming through stained glass windows painting everything in colors that seemed otherworldly. The pews were filled with familiar faces, her mother's friends, her father's political allies, Alexander's family and connections, people who'd known her since childhood. But Charlotte only had eyes for one person. Alexander stood at the altar, waiting for her, and the expression on his face when he saw her walk down the aisle made her breath catch. Love. Pure, uncomplicated, overwhelming love. Like she was the most precious thing in his world, like he couldn't quite believe she was real. Her father walked her down the aisle, his arm steady under her trembling hand. When they reached Alexander, he formally placed her hand in the Duke's. "Take care of her," he said quietly. "Always," Alexander promised. The ceremony itself passed in a haze. Charlotte heard herself make vows, to love, to honor, to cherish, in sickness and health, for richer or poorer, as long as they both lived. Alexander's voice was steady and sure as he repeated the same words, his eyes never leaving hers. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Alexander kissed her, gentle and reverent and full of promises for their future together. The wedding breakfast at the Pemberton townhouse was smaller than her mother had wanted, but perfect for Charlotte and Alexander. Lady Agnes wept openly, no longer caring about propriety. Charlotte's father gave a speech that somehow incorporated both agricultural metaphors and genuine emotion, leaving half the guests misty-eyed. Her mother cried through the entire affair, dabbing at her eyes with a handkerchief embroidered with the Pemberton crest. Lord Rothwell raised a toast, "To the Duke and Duchess of Strathearn. May you spend the next 50 years arguing about philosophy and driving each other mad with happiness." Everyone laughed and drank, and Charlotte felt Alexander's hand find hers under the table, squeezing gently. "We did it," his eyes said. "We're married. We're married," hers answered back. "Forever." The first months of marriage were everything Alexander had promised and nothing Charlotte had expected. There was an adjustment period, learning to live together, to share space, to navigate the intimacy of daily life with another person. Charlotte discovered that Alexander sang off-key in the bath and was hopeless with cravats and needed at least 2 cups of tea before he could form coherent sentences in the morning. Alexander discovered that Charlotte read until ungodly hours and talked in her sleep about philosophy and got genuinely angry when people misquoted Shakespeare. They argued about books, about politics, about the appropriate way to manage the Highland estates, about everything and nothing. But the arguments were never mean, never cruel. They were the arguments of 2 intelligent people who respected each other enough to disagree honestly. And they laughed. So much laughter. Alexander had a dry wit that caught Charlotte by surprise. Charlotte had a talent for finding the absurd in formal situations that made Alexander snort with undignified laughter at dinner parties. Alexander taught Charlotte about estate management, the complex web of responsibilities and relationships that came with being a duchess. He introduced her to his tenants as a partner rather than an ornament, asking her opinions, valuing her input. Charlotte helped him draft speeches for Parliament, occasionally contributing her own ideas, which Alexander never failed to credit publicly. They spent evenings in their library, now truly theirs rather than his, reading together and arguing about philosophy and politics. Edinburgh society continued to watch them, waiting for cracks to appear, for the unconventional match to fail. But 6 months after the wedding, Charlotte was pregnant. Alexander's reaction was exactly what she'd expected, joy mixed with absolute terror. "A baby," he said, staring at her like she'd announced something impossible. "We're going to have a baby. An actual tiny human who depends on us entirely." "Charlotte, what if I'm terrible at this?" "Then you'll be terrible at it with me." Charlotte said, laughing at his panic. We'll muddle through together. What if I drop it? Babies are surprisingly sturdy. What if it inherits my singing voice? Then our children will never have careers in opera. This isn't funny, Charlotte. It's a little funny. They'd planned to stay in Edinburgh for the social season. Alexander had parliamentary responsibilities. Charlotte was still learning her role. But when Charlotte's pregnancy became known, Alexander made a decision that shocked society. We're moving to Strathearn Castle, he announced. I want Charlotte comfortable, away from society's judgment, able to simply be herself without performing for strangers. But the season, Charlotte protested, can manage without us, Alexander said firmly. My wife is more important than any ball. And if society cannot understand that, then society can go hang. The announcement caused a minor scandal. Dukes didn't abandon the social season for their pregnant wives. It simply wasn't done. But Alexander didn't care. He'd stopped caring what society thought the moment Charlotte walked into her father's study in that terrible gray dress. They moved to Strathearn Castle in the Highlands, a beautiful stone fortress surrounded by heather-covered moors and dramatic mountain vistas. Away from Edinburgh's gossip and expectations, Charlotte could finally breathe. The pregnancy was uneventful, the birth slightly terrifying but ultimately successful. And now they had a son, James Alexander Sinclair, heir to the Dukedom of Strathearn. 1 year after Charlotte had descended that staircase in her terrible gray dress, she stood in the nursery of Strathearn Castle, watching her husband hold their 3-month-old son with a mixture of devotion and terror that made her heart swell with love so fierce it was almost painful. He's so small, Alexander said for perhaps the 100th time that week, cradling James with exaggerated care, as if the baby might shatter at any moment. Are babies supposed to be this small? Are we certain he's healthy? He seems small, very small, unusually small. He's perfectly healthy, Charlotte assured him, settling into the rocking chair beside the window overlooking the Highland moors. Late afternoon sun streamed through the glass, painting everything gold. The physician confirmed it yesterday, and last week, and the week before that, and the week before that. But he could have grown since yesterday, Alexander argued, carefully adjusting his grip on baby James, who seemed utterly unbothered by his father's anxiety and was currently attempting to eat his own fist. Babies grow, don't they? Rather rapidly, I've been told. Not quite that quickly, love. It had been a year since that fateful October afternoon. 12 months since Charlotte had made the impulsive decision to wear her worst dress and accidentally captured the heart of a duke. 365 days since she'd walked into her father's study expecting tedium and found her future instead. The gray dress still hung in her wardrobe at the Edinburgh townhouse, Charlotte realized. She'd kept it, though she couldn't quite say why. Perhaps as a reminder that the worst moments could become the best beginnings. Perhaps as proof that authenticity, however awkward, was worth more than any performance. Perhaps simply because throwing it away felt like discarding the thing that had changed her entire life. Lady Agnes had traveled from Edinburgh to stay with them for the month, delighting in her role as great aunt. She was currently in the drawing room with Charlotte's parents, who'd come to visit for a fortnight, arguing about politics with Charlotte's father whilst her mother fussed over nursery arrangements. This particular afternoon, all 3 of their relatives had descended on Strathearn Castle simultaneously, filling the ancient stones with laughter and good-natured arguments about everything from estate management to the correct way to swaddle an infant. You know, Lady Agnes had said earlier, holding James while Alexander and Charlotte took a rare moment to themselves in the library. I never thought I'd see Alexander this happy. He spent so many years being what everyone expected rather than pursuing what he wanted. And now look at him, arguing about philosophy with his brilliant wife, fretting over his son like every new father, finally just being himself. Charlotte had smiled, watching through the window as Alexander walked through the gardens, his hands clasped behind his back, that slight furrow between his brows that meant he was thinking deeply about something. He gave me the same gift, the permission to be myself without apology. You gave each other that gift, Agnes had corrected. That's what makes this work. Now, watching Alexander gently rock their son while murmuring nonsense about crop rotation and philosophical principles, Charlotte felt so full of happiness she thought she might burst. What are you thinking about? Alexander asked, looking up from James to catch her staring. That dress, Charlotte admitted. The gray one. And how terrified I was that day. How certain I was that I'd be invisible forever. How convinced I was that no one would ever see me as anything more than the Earl's unmarriageable daughter. And now, Alexander prompted, moving to sit on the arm of her chair, James still cradled carefully in his arms. Now I'm exactly as visible as I want to be, Charlotte said softly, reaching up to touch his face. To the one person whose opinion actually matters. Alexander leaned down to kiss her forehead, mindful of the baby between them. You were never invisible to me, Charlotte. Even when I was too much of a coward to do anything about it. You were always the most fascinating woman in any room. James made a small sound, not quite a cry, but a declaration that he was awake and had opinions about the current situation. Someone's hungry, Charlotte said, reaching for him, and probably needs changing. Again, how can someone so small produce so much? Don't finish that sentence, Alexander said, laughing. I'm trying to maintain my illusions about the romance of fatherhood. They spent the afternoon as they often did, a strange but perfect mixture of domestic chaos and profound contentment. James nursed and was changed and fussed over by his great-aunt and grandparents. Dinner was a lively affair with competing conversations about politics and philosophy and whether James had smiled or merely had gas. Later, after their relatives had retired and James had finally been settled in his cradle, Charlotte and Alexander sat together in their library, her favorite room in the entire estate. Floor-to-ceiling books, windows overlooking the moors, worn leather chairs that had molded to their shapes over months of evening reading sessions. Alexander was ostensibly reviewing some agricultural report, but Charlotte noticed his eyes kept straying to her over the top of the pages. What? She finally asked, looking up from her own book, a new translation of Kant that she was finding fascinatingly frustrating. I was just thinking, Alexander said, setting aside his papers entirely, about that afternoon when you came downstairs in that terrible dress. How different our lives would be if you dressed appropriately, if you tried to impress me instead of being yourself. Charlotte marked her place in the book and set it aside. We might not have married. You might have had one polite conversation with me and moved on, assuming I was like every other lady you'd met. Exactly. Alexander stood and moved to sit beside her on the sofa, pulling her against his side. She fit there perfectly now, after months of practice, her head resting in the hollow of his shoulder like it had been designed for that purpose. I might have married someone appropriate and suitable, he continued, his voice quiet in the lamplight. Someone beautiful and accomplished who never challenged me, never made me think, never truly knew me. I might have spent the rest of my life being profoundly lonely while surrounded by people. Charlotte felt his hand come up to her face, tilting it so she had to look at him. His dark blue eyes were serious, intense with emotion. But you wore that terrible dress. You argued with me about philosophy. You treated me like a person rather than a title. And you changed my entire life, Charlotte. You gave me permission to want something real instead of something appropriate. You showed me that authenticity mattered more than appearance, that being known was more valuable than being admired. You taught me the same things, Charlotte whispered, her throat tight with emotion. That I didn't need to diminish myself to be lovable. That my intelligence and opinions weren't flaws to hide, but strengths to celebrate. That the right person would love me for who I actually am rather than for who I could pretend to be. The right person does love you, Alexander said softly, his thumb tracing the line of her cheekbone. Desperately, completely, for exactly who you are. Every opinion, every argument, every moment of brilliant stubbornness. From the nursery down the hall, James made a small crying sound, not distressed, just announcing his presence, demanding attention in the way babies do. They both stood immediately, moving in perfect synchronization toward their son. Some things, Charlotte thought, became automatic with practice, the shared glance that said I'll get him, the way they could communicate without words after a year of marriage, the partnership that had developed through countless small moments of choosing each other. Alexander reached the nursery first and lifted James carefully, making soothing sounds while rocking him gently. Hello, little man. Did you miss us? We were only gone for an hour. That's not very independent of you. Charlotte watched them from the doorway, her husband and son, silhouetted against the window where stars were beginning to appear over the Highland moors. This was everything she'd wanted without knowing she wanted it. Not just the romance, not just the title, not just the love, but this partnership of equals. This life built on authenticity rather than performance. This family created from honesty and mutual respect and the courage to be themselves. Charlotte, Alexander said, looking up from James, his voice carrying an odd tone. Come here. I want to hold both of you. She moved to his side, and Alexander wrapped them both in his embrace, his wife and son, his chosen family, his unexpected happiness. Thank you, he said quietly, his lips against her hair. For what? For wearing that terrible dress. For being yourself. For loving me back. For giving me this life I didn't know I needed. Thank you, Charlotte whispered back. For seeing me when I felt invisible. For valuing what society deemed worthless. For choosing me when you could have had anyone. You were never worthless, Alexander said firmly. And I didn't choose you in spite of other options. I chose you because there were no other options. Not really. There was only ever you, Charlotte. From that first conversation 2 years ago, there was only ever you. James gurgled between them, apparently agreeing, or perhaps just wanting attention. They both laughed, the sound mixing with the settling sounds of the ancient castle around them, creaking beams, wind through stone, the distant call of night birds on the moors. Do you think he'll inherit your stubbornness or mine? Alexander asked, looking down at their son. Both, probably, Charlotte said. The poor child doesn't stand a chance. He'll be brilliant and argumentative and absolutely impossible to manage, Alexander said with satisfaction, pressing a kiss to James's downy head. Just like his mother. And charming and overprotective and prone to agricultural obsessions, Charlotte countered. Just like his father. We're going to raise a terror, Alexander said, but he sounded delighted by the prospect. A brilliant, authentic terror who knows that being himself matters more than meeting others' expectations. Exactly. They stood there in the nursery, lit by lamplight and starlight, the Highland moors stretching endless beyond the windows. A duke and his duchess and their tiny son, building a life based on love rather than obligation, authenticity rather than performance, choosing each other rather than choosing what society expected. Somewhere in Edinburgh, society continued its elaborate dance. Beautiful ladies competed for eligible gentlemen. Mothers schemed and plotted. The ton judged and gossiped and performed its intricate rituals, probably still occasionally discussing the Duke of Strathearn's shocking choice of bride. But here in the Highlands, Alexander and Charlotte had already found what everyone else was seeking. Genuine connection, authentic love, and the profound peace of being truly known by another person. I love you, Charlotte said, simple and true, the words she said every day, but that never felt routine, never felt less than profound. I love you too, Alexander replied, his voice warm with certainty. My brilliant, argumentative, wonderfully authentic wife. My partner in everything. James made another small sound, and they both looked down at him, this tiny person they'd created, this future they were building together. And we love you, Charlotte said to their son, running a gentle finger across his impossibly soft cheek. More than all the stars over these moors, more than all the books in our library, more than we knew it was possible to love anything. Alexander's arms tightened around them both. We should probably sleep while we can. He'll be up again in 3 hours wanting to eat. 2 hours, Charlotte corrected. He's on a schedule. A very demanding schedule. Our son, already issuing orders like a duke in training. They settled James back in his cradle, watching him fight sleep with the determination of someone who didn't want to miss anything interesting, his tiny fists waving, his legs kicking with infant indignation at being put down. Finally, his eyes drifted closed, his breathing evening out into the deep sleep of the very young. Charlotte and Alexander stood over the cradle for another moment, just watching, still amazed that they'd created this tiny, perfect person. Come to bed, Alexander said finally, taking Charlotte's hand. Tomorrow we'll have to endure more well-meaning advice from Aunt Agnes and your mother about proper childcare. We should rest while we can. They walked to their chamber hand in hand, the castle settling into nighttime quiet around them. In their room, they changed for bed with the comfortable intimacy of people who knew each other's routines, who'd stopped being shy about bodies and vulnerability months ago. In bed, Charlotte curled against Alexander's side, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest where she could hear his heartbeat, steady, solid, real. "Do you ever regret it?" Charlotte asked quietly into the darkness. "Choosing me over someone more appropriate? Causing a scandal? Dealing with society's judgment?" She felt Alexander stiffen slightly, then shift so he could look down at her, though in the darkness she could barely make out his features. "Never," he said fiercely. "Not once. Not for a single moment. Charlotte, you're the best decision I ever made. The bravest thing I ever did. Choosing you, choosing us, over what society expected is the only thing I've done in my entire life that feels completely, authentically mine." His hand found hers in the darkness, threading their fingers together. "Ask me in 50 years, and I'll say the same thing. Ask me on my deathbed, and I'll tell you that the day you walked into your father's study in that terrible gray dress was the day my real life began." Charlotte felt tears prick her eyes. "I love you. So much it sometimes scares me. So much I don't have words adequate to describe it." "I know," Alexander said softly. "I feel the same way. Like my heart is too small to contain everything I feel for you. Like words are insufficient to express what you mean to me." They lay in comfortable silence for a while, listening to each other breathe, to the wind outside their window, to the distant sound of James making small noises in his sleep in the nursery down the hall. "Charlotte," Alexander said finally. The gray dress. The one you wore that first day? Where is it?" "In my wardrobe at the Edinburgh townhouse." "What?" "Keep it," he said. "Forever. Frame it if you want. Put it in a glass case. Make it a family heirloom. Because that dress, that terrible, wonderful, perfect disaster of a dress, is the reason we have all of this." Charlotte laughed softly. "You want to make a family heirloom out of my worst dress?" "It's not your worst dress," Alexander corrected. "It's the dress that saved us both. The dress that gave me permission to choose authenticity over appearance. The dress that proved that being real matters more than being perfect." He paused, and Charlotte heard the smile in his voice. "Besides, 50 years from now, we'll be old and gray and still arguing about philosophy, and we can look at that dress and remember the day our life together began. The day we chose each other over everything else." 50 years, Charlotte repeated, testing the words, trying to imagine them old together, wrinkled and slower but still themselves, still choosing each other, still arguing and laughing and building a life on authenticity and love. 50 years, Alexander confirmed. "At minimum. I'm planning on being very stubborn about dying. I have too much to live for." Charlotte felt her heart swell with so much love it was almost painful. This man, this impossible, wonderful man who'd looked past society's expectations and seen her, who'd valued her mind and her honesty and her complete inability to be anyone but herself, who'd given her permission to take up space, to have opinions, to be brilliant and argumentative and wonderfully herself without apology. "I never thanked you," she said quietly. "For what?" "For seeing me. For looking past the terrible dress and the controversial opinions and society's judgment and seeing something worth pursuing. For making me believe that being myself was not just acceptable, but actually desirable." Alexander's arms tightened around her. "Charlotte, I should be thanking you. You saved me from a lifetime of pretending, from performing a role rather than living a life, from marrying someone appropriate and spending the rest of my days being quietly miserable whilst maintaining a perfect facade." He pressed a kiss to the top of her head. "You gave me permission to want something real, to choose happiness over duty, to be Alexander rather than just the Duke. That's a gift I can never adequately repay." "We saved each other, then," Charlotte said. "We saved each other," Alexander agreed. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, hearts beating in synchronization, two people who'd found each other against all odds and built something real and lasting and true. 3 months later, they'd return to Edinburgh for the season, and society would watch them with continued fascination, still waiting for cracks to appear, still expecting the unconventional match to fail. But it wouldn't fail. It would endure. Through seasons and years and decades. Through arguments and laughter and the beautiful chaos of raising children who inherited both their parents' stubbornness and intelligence. Through triumphs and setbacks and all the mundane moments that make up a life. Because what Alexander and Charlotte had built wasn't based on appearance or performance or meeting society's expectations. It was based on seeing each other truly, on valuing authenticity over perfection, on choosing each other every single day, even when, especially when, that choice was difficult. The worst dress in Christendom, it turned out, had been the beginning of the very best life imaginable. And 50 years later, when they were old and gray and still arguing about philosophy in their library at Strathearn Castle, they'd look back on that October afternoon and thank fate for a terrible dress, an honest conversation, and the courage to choose love over expectation. But that's a story for another time. For now, on this autumn night in the Highlands, with their son sleeping peacefully down the hall and the stars bright over the moors, Alexander and Charlotte Sinclair, Duke and Duchess of Strathearn, partners in everything, still choosing each other, slept wrapped in each other's arms, grateful for gray dresses and philosophy books and the beautiful chaos of being authentically, imperfectly, wonderfully themselves. Thank you so much for joining us on this heartfelt journey. If this story made you smile, brought a tear to your eye, or reminded you that love often finds us when we least expect it, when we're brave enough to be ourselves, we'd be honored if you liked this video, left us a comment sharing your thoughts, and shared it with someone who loves a good romance. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for supporting our storytelling channel. Your support keeps us going and helps us create more stories full of love, redemption, and the courage to choose authenticity over perfection. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss a new story. And at the end of this video, another tale awaits. Click and be surprised by more romance, passion, and unforgettable characters who dare to be themselves. Thank you for being here. Until next time, remember, sometimes the worst dress becomes the beginning of the best life.